Hey there, curious minds. Tonight we're diving deep into something that's oddly comforting, what samurai actually wore to bed. You might be imagining some stoic warrior clanking into his futon still wrapped in iron plates, a katana tucked beneath his pillow like a medieval teddy bear. But no, take that image, set it gently on fire, and blow the ashes into the wind. Because while samurai lived in a world of discipline, hierarchy, and constant preparedness, even they weren't lunatics about bedtime. The truth is quieter, softer, more layered, sometimes literally, and a whole lot more human. You close your eyes and it's a moonlit night in Edo period Japan. Crickets hum outside paper screen walls. The smell of tatami matting mingles with the fading warmth of a wood fire bath. Somewhere not far off, a gate clunks shut and all falls still. Inside a modest but well-kept home, a samurai unfastens the final tie of his day armor. His breath slow, his movements deliberate. He isn't getting ready for a duel. He's getting ready for bed. And spoiler alert, no chainmail is involved. Quick favor, before you dive into full-on relaxation mode, consider liking and subscribing. It helps more than you know, and I genuinely appreciate it if you do. If not, no worries, I'm just glad you're here. If you want to leave a comment, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know who's drifting off around the world with me tonight. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Let's take a moment to leave the noise of the day behind. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you might think a samurai sleeps in armor just in case something wild happens. A midnight raid, a dishonorable duel, a surprise ninja hiding behind the bonsai. But here's the thing. Armor was awful to sleep in. Heavy, rigid, and about as cozy as cuddling a pile of sharp gardening tools. So instead, once the doors were shut and duty could pause for a few hours, samurai slipped into something a little less murder-proof. Typically, this meant a kasode. Not a bathrobe, but not far off either. It was a T-shaped, kimono-style garment made of breathable linen or cotton. Simple to put on, easy to move in, and surprisingly stylish depending on the rank of the wearer. And no, it wasn't purple with dancing dragons unless you were particularly eccentric or had very brave tailors. This kasode was modest, sometimes dyed in indigo or brown, with subtle family crests stitched into the fabric if you were someone who liked to flex even while asleep. Beneath the kasode, some samurai wore a thin inner robe or loincloth. This wasn't just about modesty, it helped absorb sweat and regulate temperature. Because while Japan's winters could nip, the summers were relentless. Ever tried sleeping in a humid wooden house with no AC and a layer of armor glued to your ribs by your own sweat? Yeah, that's a hard no from history. But here's something quirky. Some wealthier samurai had sleepwear custom dyed with special insect-repelling patterns, using plant-based indigo to ward off mosquitoes. You wouldn't expect fashion to double as bug spray, but that's the kind of practical beauty this era specialized in. Historians still argue whether these repellents actually worked or were more spiritual than scientific. But either way, you wouldn't catch a high-ranking samurai without his dyed sleep robes during summer. Now picture this. The room's been swept, candles trimmed. You kneel gently on a rolled-out futon which, despite the modern versions we think of, is not that thick. Just a layered mat on tatami flooring, firm but clean, with a headrest made of wood or ceramic. Not fluffy, not plush, but designed to hold the head at just the right angle to keep the spine straight and posture honorable, even in unconsciousness. Because yes, posture mattered. No one wanted to die in their sleep looking like a discarded scarecrow, and they never slept completely unarmed. Within arm's reach of that futon, almost always, rested a sheathed wakizashi, the shorter companion blade to the katana. It wasn't a paranoia thing, not exactly. It was a statement. Even in sleep, the samurai was prepared to defend, protect, or, if it came to it, take responsibility in the ultimate, irreversible way. Seppuku wasn't exactly a bedtime activity, but the symbolism lingered like incense smoke. Now let's talk headwear, or rather the absence of it. No, they didn't wear helmets or those dramatic top knots wrapped in iron at night. Most samurai let their hair down, literally. If they wore a chonmage, that shaved part top knot combo, they'd undo it for bed, letting the remaining hair breathe. Sometimes they wore thin linen caps, not unlike nightcaps in Victorian England, though these were for warmth, not Dickensian drama, and they helped prevent lice, a subtle but important enemy in a pre-pesticide world. You settle in, imagining the layered sounds of nighttime Kyoto or Edo. A bamboo water spout clacks in a neighbor's garden. Somewhere, a dog barks once and is shushed. Inside, the air smells faintly of sandalwood and rice straw. You're wrapped in light cotton, bare feet tucked neatly under a patterned sheet. You're not wearing armor. You're not even thinking about war, at least not until the dreams start. And here's a bit of trivia that might surprise you. Some samurai didn't just ditch armor for comfort. They avoided it at night because of superstition. Armor was sacred, symbolic, and to many, not to be sullied by sleep. Leaving it piled up in a neat corner was an act of respect, not just for the equipment, but for the spirit of battle itself. You wouldn't put your war mask next to your toothbrush. Same principle. Of course, not all samurai had the luxury of bedtime routine. During active campaigns, they might only strip to their underrobe and roll up in a travel mat under a tree. But even then, they avoided sleeping in full armor. Too many sharp edges, too much clanking, and heaven forbid you try to roll over. One historian joked it'd be like trying to sleep inside a filing cabinet filled with knives. Still, as you drift back to that imagined bedroom, the picture is clearer now. No armor, no dramatic poses. Just a disciplined man, wrapped in quiet robes, one blade within reach, and the weight of the day finally allowed to lift off his shoulders. You feel it now too, the unclenching, the settling, the slow exhale of a warrior finally off duty, and maybe that's the most honest image of all. You step softly across creaking wooden floors, the soles of your feet cooled by polished cedar planks that still carry the memory of the sun. This is no battlefield. No roar of horses or clang of metal rings out here. Instead, you find yourself in the quiet interior of a samurai's home, specifically the sleeping quarters, those tucked-away rooms where duty is folded and set aside, if only until sunrise. These spaces were more than just places to rest. They were reflections of status, order, and the delicate dance between austerity and indulgence that defined the samurai class. A samurai's home wasn't a fortress, at least not in the Western sense. It was structured with purpose, sometimes rigid, sometimes surprisingly fluid. Rooms were divided by sliding paper screens known as shoji and fusuma, thin enough to let in moonlight, thick enough to whisper privacy. And while you might expect lavish decorations, the truth leaned toward simplicity. The aesthetic was rooted in wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection and impermanence. So no gold leaf murals or towering statues here. Just sparse elegance, maybe a hanging scroll with seasonal poetry, a single vase with a clipped branch, and floor mats precisely placed. You kneel in the zashiki, the main living room by day, and in many cases, the bedroom by night. Futons were stored away during the day in a closet called an ashiire, and only taken out in the evening. You might feel cheated by the lack of a designated bedroom, but there's something intimate about this nightly transformation. One minute you're serving tea or reciting poetry with a visitor, and the next, you're rolling out bedding in that same space and surrendering to sleep. Talk about multifunctional design. Now imagine being a mid-level retainer. Your chamber isn't huge, just big enough for a futon, a sword rack, and perhaps a lacquered box for personal effects. There's little furniture. You don't sit in chairs. You kneel or cross your legs on cushions. Even the act of preparing for bed follows its own rhythm. You might dust your blade before sleep, offer incense at the small shrine in the corner, and recite a Buddhist chant or two if you're the spiritual type. Not all samurai were. Some were more concerned with sake than sutras, but the rituals mattered, whether sacred or secular. The construction of the room itself played into the nightly experience. Thick tatami mats muted sound and insulated heat. The paper windows filtered in moonlight like a soft, glowing watercolor. Outside, gravel paths wound quietly through stone gardens, designed to crunch audibly if stepped on at night. It was a form of passive security, not traps or guards, but sound. You'd hear the approach of feet, even in a house meant for rest. In wealthier homes, a samurai might have a private room or even a separate sleeping annex. These were sometimes slightly raised with wooden steps, separating rest from everyday life. If you had the money and rank, you might even commission fragrant woods like kaya or hinoki, not just for the pleasant scent, but for their anti-insect properties. Imagine falling asleep while the aroma of cypress weaves its way through your senses, mingling with the clean smell of rice, straw, and ash from the dying hearth. You're halfway asleep already, aren't you? Let's not forget the sliding doors. Yes, they were lightweight and beautiful, but also notoriously unreliable at blocking sound. Privacy was always an illusion in the world of the samurai. You were never truly alone, never far from your family, your retinue, or your responsibilities. That meant your bedtime habits couldn't be embarrassing or overly indulgent. No midnight dance parties, no snoring symphonies. In fact, some samurai practiced breath control to reduce nighttime noise, because even in sleep, your reputation mattered. Now, let's flip perspectives. Imagine you're a servant. You're padding barefoot down the hallway, checking that the lanterns are extinguished and that your master's water basin is refilled. You peek into the sleeping quarters and see the subtle outline of the futon, the curve of the blade resting near the pillow, the still form of a man trained to wake at the sound of a whisper. It's eerie in a beautiful way. Peace balanced on the edge of potential violence. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some samurai homes included a night closet or hidden compartment near the bedding area. Not for swords or valuables, but for quick access to clothing or emergency supplies. Think of it like a pre-modern nightstand, except hidden inside the wall like a ninja might use. Historians still argue whether these spaces were standard architectural features or customized oddities, depending on the paranoia level of the homeowner. As for lighting, candles or oil lamps were used sparingly at night. Fire was always a threat in wooden homes, so once the family was settled in, most flames were extinguished, leaving only the faint glow of a coal brazier or the pale white of moonlight across paper walls. Shadows moved slowly, stretching like cats along the tatami. It was peaceful but never careless. Even asleep, a samurai's world stayed quietly alert. Some homes included an engawa, a narrow veranda space that wrapped around the interior, allowing airflow in summer and serving as a barrier between outside and in. At night, this served another purpose. A samurai might sit here in contemplation before bed, listening to the night insects, cooling off from the bath, or simply watching shadows drift. Think of it like your modern wind-down scroll through a phone, but with more existential dread and less doom-scrolling. Of course, location influenced design. Urban samurai in Edo had tighter quarters, stacked vertically with steep wooden staircases. Country samurai had more land, more privacy, and often more elaborate gardens that cooled the home and pleased the senses before sleep. In both cases, the sleeping chamber remained a sacred space of restoration, and while you might expect them to be cold and utilitarian, the opposite was often true. The samurai knew the cost of unrest. You couldn't wield a blade well with an exhausted mind, so the sleep space, however small, was cared for. No armor in sight, just cotton robes folded neatly. A polished wakizashi resting in silence, the ghost of incense still lingering on the breeze. and someone breathing softly, the rhythmic rise and fall of a chest beneath a light blanket, as dreams creep in like low tide against the walls of a house that, just for now, isn't a battlefield. You step out of the bath, skin tingling from the heat, and the cool night air slides along your arms like silk. Your servant, or if you're a lower-ranking samurai, you sets aside the towel and reaches for the first of several garments stacked neatly on a lacquered tray. These aren't pajamas in the way you know them. There's no elastic waistband or novelty cartoon print, no hoodie-footy onesie, but the comfort is there, and it's layered, soft, and deliberate. You're about to dress for sleep in the quiet armor of cotton and linen. The first layer is simple fundoshi, a loincloth that wraps snugly around the hips and between the legs, tied off in a firm knot at the back. It's a basic but crucial start, and it's been used in Japan for centuries. Practical, breathable, and surprisingly secure once you've learned the art of tying it. You tuck it neatly, and already, you're halfway into the nightly transformation. Next comes the harajuban, a thin inner robe worn like a second skin. This piece is lightweight and absorbent, designed to wick away sweat and maintain modesty under the outer layer. If you're lucky or wealthy, it's made from soft, brushed cotton. If you're wealthier still, it might be woven from hemp or linen, both prized for their cooling qualities in humid climates. The harajuban doesn't show, but it matters. Because even in sleep, the samurai thought about balance. Warmth without heaviness, modesty without fuss. Over that goes the yukata or nemaki, depending on the time period and region. Both are simple kimono-style garments, worn with a loose sash called an obai, nothing tight, just enough to keep things in place. The yukata is the more recognizable term today, often worn at hot springs or festivals, but for the samurai, it served as a lightweight robe that moved with the body. Soft folds settle around your legs as you step lightly across the room. You feel neither bound nor exposed, just covered enough to sleep with dignity, and the materials mattered. Cotton was king, imported, costly, and increasingly available during the Edo period, thanks to trade and domestic cultivation. It was cooler than silk, sturdier than paper, and far more comfortable than any wool nonsense you might imagine from European bedclothes. Linen and hemp were common among lower ranks or in summer months, both praised for their breathability. Silk was rare for sleepwear, too expensive, too delicate, too prone to wear. That was for ceremonies, not snoozing. But here's a little fringe detail. Certain samurai families passed down robes specifically meant for sleep, hand-dyed, family-crested yukata reserved only for descendants. These were worn until they literally unraveled, believed to carry protective qualities and the calm of generations before. Historians still argue whether these robes were primarily practical, spiritual, or just sentimentally clung to laundry. Either way, they were treasured and never burned or discarded hastily. Some samurai preferred darker fabrics, especially indigo-dyed cotton, not just for aesthetics, though indigo does look rather sharp under candlelight, but because it acted as a natural insect repellent. A samurai's sleep wasn't just about comfort, it was also tactical. Repel mosquitoes, hide stains, and still look composed if someone burst through your door at midnight with news or nonsense. And yet, even in this careful system of garments, individuality crept in. Some warriors preferred thicker robes in winter, layered with padded cotton lining and stitched hems. Others went minimalist, sleeping nearly bare under a single robe during summer's heat, tossing and turning on tatami that absorbed more sweat than it ever wanted to admit. There were personal habits, too, folds tucked just so, sleeves rolled under, or the obai tied a little off-center for ease of movement. And then there's the curious case of the sleeping sleeves. While most robes were long-sleeved, some samurai had nightwear specially tailored with shortened or detachable sleeves. Why? Because waking up tangled in your own kimono is neither elegant nor efficient, especially if you're trying to grab a blade in the dark. One offhand historian even joked that short-sleeve nemaki were the boxer briefs of feudal Japan. Functional, unglamorous, and entirely necessary. As you settle onto the futon, the texture of cotton brushing softly against skin, it's worth noting that these garments weren't washed daily. Soap was rare and washing involved scrubbing in rivers or heating water over fire. So robes were often aired, beaten clean, or refreshed with smoke and herbal sachets tucked into storage drawers. Lavender wasn't common, but mugwort, camphor, or dried citrus peel might do the trick. Anything to chase off mildew and moths. By the way, don't imagine a closet like yours. These garments were stored carefully, folded with methodical precision and stacked in wooden chests lined with paper. A badly folded robe said something about your discipline or lack thereof, and a wrinkled nemaki, that was just asking to wake up with creases in your honor. Samurai weren't necessarily obsessed with fashion, but they were definitely allergic to sloppiness. As for the barefoot experience, yes, samurai went to bed without socks, especially in warmer months. In colder seasons, they might wear tabai, the iconic split-toe socks, usually cotton. But even those were sometimes avoided to let the feet breathe. There's something deeply human about that choice, don't you think? That even the sword-wielding elite like the feel of a cool floor under warm toes. Now picture yourself wrapped in cotton, the soft layers whispering against your skin. The room is quiet. You shift slightly, your breath warm in the folds of the yukata. You are swaddled, not like a baby, but like someone who's spent all day being sharp and finally has permission to go soft. Outside, the wind stirs a bamboo curtain. Inside, a candle gutters low. You close your eyes. The layers hold you modest and secure. No armor, no pretense. Just sleepwear, steeped in centuries of thought, practicality, and just a whisper of elegance. The lights are out, or rather, the lantern's been doused, and silence has fallen thick as the futon padding beneath you. But you can't quite sleep, not yet. Your hand shifts slightly under the robe, unconsciously checking the space just to your side. And there it is. Not a teddy bear, not a phone, but a blade, always within reach. You sleep as a samurai does, with a sword near your hand and one eye still dreaming of combat. Even if the last battle was a decade ago, that weapon is likely your wakizashi, the shorter companion to the long katana. Known together as the Daisho, literally big little, this pair defined your status and your soul. But at night, it was the wakizashi that stayed close. The katana was often placed on a rack, cleaned and displayed with reverence. The wakizashi, though, that was personal, shorter, more intimate. Meant for close quarters, sudden defense, or if things went really south, ritual suicide. Yeah, sleep tight. It would usually be laid to your right if you slept on your back, blade edge facing outward, handle toward your dominant hand. If you slept on your side, likely curled slightly under the weight of heavy thoughts, you might tuck it just within reach under the edge of your bedding. A movement practiced so many times it didn't need thought. Like checking if your door's locked, but with a sharp piece of metal that could end a home invasion in a whisper. And no, this wasn't paranoia. It was protocol. A warrior didn't separate from his blade. You'd no sooner leave your phone out in the street than a samurai would go to bed unarmed. Even in the most peaceful stretches of the Edo period, when violent conflict had dwindled into bureaucratic squabbles and duels of etiquette, the sword still stayed nearby, because peace was always temporary. Honor never slept deeply. Of course, there were variations. Some samurai had custom-made sword stands beside the bed, just like a nightstand, but infinitely cooler. Others tucked the blade between the futon layers, the same way a city dweller might keep pepper spray under their pillow. And then there were the hyper-vigilant types. You know the ones. Sword tied loosely to the wrist, or resting across the chest like a cold, heavy blanket of resolve. Was that overkill? Historians still argue whether such practices were common or more the stuff of overcautious lore, passed down like bedtime ghost stories with steel endings. Quirk alert. Some samurai even used sword pillows or kaitanamakura, tiny raised headrests made of wood or bamboo with a groove or opening beneath, specifically to rest the blade underneath or alongside. Yes, their version of ergonomic sleeping involved balancing a deadly weapon under their head. Apparently, comfort was subjective. You can almost picture someone half asleep muttering, "Ah yes, nothing says lumbar support like the possibility of sudden death." But not all swords were for show or sleep posture. For high-ranking samurai, the night might mean being on call. A messenger could arrive, breathless, demanding attention. A political betrayal might erupt into a bloodless standoff in the courtyard. So that sword, yes, even the little one, was more than protection, it was readiness. You didn't go to bed imagining battle, but you stayed capable of it, just in case. Now pause and imagine the ritual. Before bed, you place the blade gently, never drop it, never toss it. You might wipe it clean with a cloth, check the fittings, even mutter a phrase of thanks. It's not just steel, it's the soul of your station. You place it on the woven mat like an offering, one that doubles as a security system. There's something deeply poetic and slightly insane about the idea of cradling lethal force in the glow of moonlight and incense smoke. Some samurai even developed sleep strategies around their blade placement. Sleep on the left, blade on the right. Sleep lightly. Listen for the crunch of gravel outside. Don't drink too much sake. Don't snore. If someone sneaks in and you don't wake up, you're not just embarrassed, you're potentially dead. It's a mindset that turns even bedtime into a mental kata. Precision, calm, awareness. But of course, not all samurai slept with the same level of intensity. Some, particularly in times of genuine peace, relaxed a little. Maybe the blade stayed within arm's reach but wrapped in cloth. Maybe it was displayed on a stand but slightly further away. Still, present but not poised for instant action. It's like putting your alarm clock a few feet from the bed, not in hand but close enough to matter. A symbolic gesture that says, "I'm watching, but also I need 5 more minutes." And here's a detail you might not expect. Servants and family members often knew the sleeping sword arrangement of the house head. It was part of household choreography. No stepping too close, no tripping over scabbards in the dark. Children were taught not to touch. Wives, if present, would fold the bedding around the blade without crossing it. Respect didn't pause just because someone was in their pajamas. It's worth noting, too, that some samurai died by their own hand in that very space, using the wakizashi that once stood guard each night. The ritual of seppuku was often done at home in private quarters. The same blade that promised protection could, in darker hours, become the executor of shame's final demand. But don't dwell on that just yet. Let's not turn your bedtime into a tragedy. Just know that the blade meant many things, and sleep was never entirely innocent of its weight. What's amazing is how integrated the sword was into the soft moments of the samurai's life. It wasn't just for duels, processions, or portraits. It lay beside him as he listened to cicadas, as he drifted into dreams, as he pressed his cheek to a cotton pillow and let the chaos of duty dissolve for a few precious hours. Still sharp, still there, a quiet reminder that even in peace, the warrior within never truly closed both eyes. So you lie there now, the futon pressed gently against your back, the weight of the cotton yukata a soft hush over your chest. Just beside you the blade waits. Not drawn, not angry, just present. It hums like a second heartbeat, not enough to wake you, just enough to keep you from ever falling completely asleep. The room is quiet except for the creak of wood beams overhead and the distant hoot of an owl nestled somewhere out in the garden. You've washed, you've layered up, and your sword rests exactly where it should. Now it's time to lie down, but don't expect a 4-poster bed or a pillow-top mattress. You're about to ease yourself into the minimalist, meticulously arranged world of samurai sleeping quarters. That means futons, tatami, and a sleep style closer to camping than luxury, yet somehow still elegant. Let's start with the ground. The floor beneath your feet isn't hardwood or stone, it's tatami. Thick mats woven from rice straw and covered with soft, tightly sewn igusa grass, slightly springy, faintly sweet-smelling, and arranged in patterns that follow traditional room layouts like a code only architects and ghosts fully understand. They're not just practical flooring, they're sacred geometry. You're not supposed to step on certain edges, not because it's rude, but because spirits might linger there. No pressure, right? Over the tatami, servants, or you, if you're doing the full solo warrior experience, unroll the shikabuton, the sleeping mattress. This isn't the Western-style futon you're picturing, folded awkwardly like a taco shell in a college apartment. This is thin, foldable, and filled with cotton, laid directly on the floor. It's surprisingly supportive, even if the first time you lie on it, you briefly wonder if your spine will file a formal complaint. But after a while, you feel it. That strange comfort that comes from being so grounded. Literally. Next comes the cakebuton, the comforter or top blanket, which is usually stuffed with more cotton or layered hemp. Depending on the season, it might be thick and quilted or paper thin. In winter, it's heavy enough to make you sigh with relief when it's laid across your chest. In summer, it's light enough to flick off with a half turn. The materials were thoughtfully chosen: cotton, hemp, sometimes silk if you were rich and irresponsible. Always breathable, always functional. And then the makura, the pillow. Or, in many cases, the wooden or ceramic headdress that barely qualifies as soft unless you've trained your neck to behave like a disciplined soldier. The takamakura, or raised pillow, was sometimes filled with buckwheat husks or even porcelain beads, designed to keep your head elevated and your elaborate top knot perfectly intact overnight. That's right. Sleep posture and hairstyle maintenance were a package deal. Historians still argue whether these headdresses were truly comfortable or just aesthetic torture devices passed down out of stubbornness. Now, here's a quirky little wrinkle. During the Edo period, samurai houses often had a special bedding chest or storage alcove built right into the wall called an ashiire. At night, bedding was pulled out, fluffed, and arranged. Come morning, everything was folded and stored away like a pop-up dream. There were no unmade beds in the samurai world. Sleeping space by night, tea ceremony zone by day. Multifunctional living, centuries ahead of modern design trends. And what about the ambience? The room wouldn't be pitch black unless you were in the countryside. Most samurai rooms were lit by andon, a paper lantern with oil-fed flame, or chachin, a collapsible paper lantern you could carry or hang. The glow was warm, the shadows dramatic. Enough light to navigate to the door or spot a spider crawling toward your face. Not that you'd scream, "You're a samurai, remember." You'd simply flick it away with the calm of someone trained to duel. Speaking of crawling things, mosquitoes were a seasonal nightmare, especially in the humid summer months. So samurai households often burned mosquito-repelling incense like senko, made from plants like chrysanthemum, wormwood, or camphor. A thin trail of smoke wound its way across the ceiling, keeping bugs at bay and giving the room the pleasant scent of bitter herbs and smoldering calm. Some even hung kaya, mosquito nets, from ceiling beams to encase the futon in a light, gauzy dome. You sleep looking like a ghost, but at least you won't wake up itchy. Now remember, the futon wasn't just about physical rest, it was about spiritual discipline. You were expected to lie flat, keep your arms at your sides or gently over your chest, and wake without groaning like an old cartwheel. There was honor in stillness, grace in sleep. No tossing, no sprawling. You're a warrior, not a starfish. And definitely no cuddling the sword. That's a one-way ticket to a midnight stab wound and a very awkward eulogy. Even the act of lying down followed a rhythm. You'd kneel first, then slide to one side, then ease your back onto the futon. Movements practiced, slow, almost ritualistic. like you were entering a temple made of cotton and quiet. This wasn't just sleep, it was a form of meditation. A nightly return to simplicity and order. No fluff, no excess. Just enough to rest the bones and ready the mind. And if you woke up in the middle of the night, no phone, no doom scrolling. Maybe you sat up, poured yourself a small cup of water from the bedside takuri. Maybe you meditated briefly, or just listened to the creak of bamboo in the wind. Some samurai even kept a brush and ink nearby to jot down midnight thoughts, dreams, or poetic lines they'd whisper to no one in particular. The moon stares back / through shoji screens. Unmoving / I stare back as well. Not bad for 3 a.m. haiku. As for shared sleeping, married samurai couples often slept separately, particularly in wealthier households. Each with their own futon, their own space. Sleep wasn't always a social affair, but in some homes, especially among lower-ranked samurai with less room to spare, the whole family might sleep together in a single room. Children curled at the edges, the sword nestled between futons, and a layered hush settling over everyone like an extra blanket of tradition. You lie back now, head cradled awkwardly but respectfully by the stiff makura, the futon whispering against the tatami with each subtle shift. The yukata sleeve slides down your wrist. You listen to the night sounds, the distant bark of a guard dog, the click of a bamboo water fountain tipping and resetting. You are floor-bound, yes, but not uncomfortable. This is grounded rest. Measured, balanced. Every layer chosen, every scent considered. You sleep not like royalty, not like a monk, but like a samurai, anchored to earth, sword at your side, and dreams waiting just behind your half-closed eyes. Your head sinks ever so slightly into the makura, and the futon's gentle weight settles over your legs like a well-trained cat. But before any of that happened, you slipped into something a little less deadly than your armor and a little more breathable. Enter the yukata, the unsung hero of samurai sleepwear. Soft, simple, and surprisingly stylish. It's what stood between you and the cold night air, and let's be honest, between you and a truly embarrassing midnight run-in with the neighbors. The yukata wasn't just a robe. It was the robe. Made of lightweight cotton, cut in a simple T-shape, and secured with a modest sash called an obai, it was the Goda garment for after-bath lounging, post-training unwinding, and yes, heading off to bed in samurai households across Japan. Unlike the heavily layered and ornate kimono worn during formal events or on the battlefield beneath armor, the yukata was humble, breezy, designed for comfort and ease of movement. It's the kind of thing you toss on with a sigh and a stretch after a long day of pretending you didn't want to stab half your coworkers. Now, depending on your rank, your yukata might be plain or patterned. High-ranking samurai sometimes had seasonal motifs dyed into the cotton, waves for summer, falling leaves for autumn, cranes for winter, and blossoms for spring. Subtle, of course. You weren't throwing a pajama party, but there was an art to even the most intimate fabrics. If you were lower-ranking or less concerned with flair, it might be undyed cotton, soft off-white, or a gentle indigo from the local dyer. Either way, it was yours, and it smelled faintly of cedar chest and rice bran soap. The yukata wasn't worn with all the accessories you'd see during the day. No sandals indoors. No sword belts. Just you, the robe, and maybe a light undershirt or extra sash if it was winter and your bones squeaked a little more than usual. In summer, it was often the only thing standing between you and complete sweat-based extinction. Samurai homes could be breezy, yes, but humid nights were still a thing. So a thin, absorbent cotton yukata was essential to keeping your dignity intact through the stickier months. And don't forget, this was a society that valued cleanliness almost spiritually. The yukata wasn't just comfort wear, it was post-bath wear. Most samurai bathed in the early evening, either soaking in a personal wooden tub if wealthy, or visiting a communal bath if not. Afterward, you'd towel off with a square of hemp cloth, powder your neck and chest with finely milled rice starch. Maybe comb your hair with camellia oil, and then, finally, wrap yourself in the yukata. It was the final step in the cleansing ritual, a fabric exhale. Now here's a fun fringe tidbit. Some yukata were scented intentionally. Samurai wives or personal attendants might hang them with sachets of incense-infused herbs, lavender, sandalwood, or the famous kodo blends used in aristocratic perfume ceremonies. Yes, even samurai, whose job descriptions included phrases like possible death before breakfast, still wanted to smell like a forest breeze. Don't be fooled by the blade, they cared deeply about vibe maintenance. Of course, like all things samurai, there were rules. You didn't just throw it on backward or tie the sash in a sloppy knot. The left side was always folded over the right, reversing that was reserved for corpses, and no one wanted to tempt fate before bedtime. The obi was tied snug but not tight, just enough to keep the robe from flapping open if you had to leap from your futon mid-dream to chase off a burglar or a particularly bold raccoon. Style and readiness in one sleepy package. Children of samurai families wore mini yukata to bed, often in brighter prints. Apprentices and younger retainers had rougher cotton versions, sometimes hand-me-downs from their seniors, slightly frayed but still dignified. Even elderly samurai, those retired to tea and poetry, stuck to the yukata, some with added quilted linings to help their joints survive another cold morning. It was one of those few garments that truly traveled with you across a lifetime. From your first toddler tumble on the tatami to your final breath under the futon, the yukata wrapped you in quiet consistency. And while there are no official bedtime selfies from the Edo period, tragically, artwork and scrolls do hint at yukata scenes. A samurai seated beside an oil lamp, robe loose at the collar, writing a letter by moonlight. Another sipping tea before sleep, feet tucked beneath him, katana resting nearby, yukata sleeves rolled slightly up. These moments of stillness were captured with the same reverence as battle scenes, because rest was also part of the warrior's rhythm. You weren't just allowed to unwind, you were expected to master it. Here's a curious debate among historians. Did some samurai sleep nude beneath the yukata or wear under layers? Some argue it depended on region, wealth, or household modesty norms. Others believe underrobes made of hemp or silk were common, especially in winter or shared quarters. The records are patchy, and no one's found a bedtime dress code pinned to a castle wall yet. Still, the dominant view suggests comfort was king. You wore what kept you asleep and sane, or at least less sweaty. And before you dismiss the yukata as just an old bathrobe, remember this: there's a reason it's still worn today. Summer festivals, hot spring resorts, traditional inns, they all offer yukata to guests. Slip one on, and you're stepping into centuries of sleepy tradition. A robe that's seen fireflies, heard the hush of bamboo groves, and wrapped warriors, poets, and daydreamers alike in its uncomplicated embrace. So now, as your legs slide under the futon and your shoulders exhale into the evening, your yukata shifts gently with you. It rustles like rice stalks in a breeze. It holds the warmth of your bath, the calm of the tatami, and the quiet dignity of a long day survived. You aren't armored anymore. You aren't posturing or dueling or bowing through bureaucracy. You're just you, wrapped in cotton, watching the shadows dance on the paper walls. And maybe, just maybe, forgetting the weight of the sword beside you, at least for a little while. Your body might be winding down, wrapped in cotton and cradled by a futon, but your sword, the symbol of your rank, your soul, your right to call yourself samurai, is not just tossed in a corner like yesterday's laundry. No, the katana has its own bedtime routine, steeped in etiquette, superstition, and a quiet readiness that never quite sleeps. If the samurai soul lives in the blade, then this isn't just weapon storage, it's cohabitation with something sacred. Something watching over you even as your eyelids droop. You don't sleep with it tucked beneath your arm. That's a myth. You're not cuddling your katana like a bedtime teddy bear with edge trauma. Instead, you place it carefully, with the precision of a tea ceremony and the seriousness of someone who knows a blade can make or break your honor in about 4 seconds. Most samurai laid the sword to the right of the bedding, just within reach, but with the hilt pointing left. Why? Because to draw it quickly in a single motion, you'd reach across your body, ready but respectful. Aggressiveness while sleeping is a bad look, even for you. The blade stays in its saya, the wooden scabbard, of course. A naked sword left exposed overnight was considered not just reckless, but ominous. There's an old belief that drawing your blade without cause calls misfortune. Some clans even whispered that a bared sword at night might attract spirits, restless ones. And you, lying half asleep in your yukata, don't really want to test if that's true. If you're in your own home, the katana might rest on a small stand called a katanakake beside your futon, not some ostentatious rack. Just a wooden cradle to elevate the blade slightly off the tatami, protecting it from moisture and missteps. Sometimes a second, shorter blade, the wakizashi, joins it. Together they form the daisho, the warrior's paired blades. It's a little like tucking your heart and your lungs into bed beside you. Romantic in a razor's edge kind of way. And yes, there are rules for how the sword rests even when you're unconscious. The edge, or ha, should face upward, both to preserve the blade's sharpness, and because it's a subtle show of control. Edge down says, I'm not ready. An edge up says, I'm always ready. But it's more than just practicality. It's a quiet reminder that even in your most vulnerable moments, you are still samurai, still a blade in repose. Here's something oddly charming. Some samurai placed a fukusa, or small silk cloth, over the sword at night. Not to hide it, but to show reverence. Covering the katana was a mark of respect, like drawing curtains around a sleeping child. Others might burn a stick of incense near the weapon before bed, believing the scent purified both blade and bearer. These weren't official rituals, just habits passed down through generations, more spiritual than strategic. Historians still argue whether this was more superstition or sincerity, but isn't it always a bit of both when steel meets silence? There's even debate over whether a samurai should keep his sword by the bed at all. Some schools of thought believed too close a bond to the blade disrupted peace of mind. Others insisted it was cowardly not to. The middle path, keep it nearby, but not obsessively. Within reach, but not within obsession's grasp. Your mind, after all, needs sleep as much as your sword needs polish. And it did need polish, sometimes even at night. Some particularly fastidious samurai might spend their twilight hours gently oiling the blade with choji oil, a mix of clove and mineral oil, using rice paper or silk cloth to wipe down the steel. The scent was oddly calming, like sharpening serenity. It was both care and meditation, like brushing your teeth if your teeth could decapitate someone on the wrong day. Now picture this, it's a cold winter night. You've settled in, the room dimly lit by the last flicker of a lantern. Your sword rests in its stand, a shadowy presence beside you. The scabbard gleams faintly in the low light. You reach out, not to grab it, but just to check that it's there, that it hasn't been stolen in your dreams or spirited away by some trickster ghost with a grudge. Your fingers brush the lacquered wood. It's cool, solid, unmoving. You exhale. There are old tales whispered in low voices of samurai who spoke to their swords before sleeping. Not prayers exactly, more like acknowledgments. Thank you for keeping me alive today. Don't wake me unless you have to. Maybe it was poetic. Maybe it was paranoid. But when you carry death on your hip for years, you learn to treat it like a roommate with moods. One you really don't want to upset. And then there's the practical side. Burglars, assassins, angry neighbors, rogue raccoons with ninja training. Whatever might cross your threshold at 2 a.m., you need to be ready without fumbling around like a drunk toddler in a closet. So the sword is positioned with care, reachable but safe. Your hand knows where it is even in the dark. Muscle memory kicks in faster than thought. You've trained for this. You're groggy but deadly, the perfect bedtime energy. Not all weapons made it to the bedroom, of course. Spears, bows, and heavier arms were stored elsewhere, hallways, armories, walls. The katana, however, stayed close, not just because it was practical, but because it belonged there. It was personal. It was you, in steel form, cooling off after a long day. The sword slept, too but lightly, like a dog with one eye open, like a poem half-finished on the tip of your tongue. And if you ever woke with a jolt, heart pounding, eyes scanning the darkness, your hand would move before your mind did. You wouldn't even think, just grip, rise, ready. That's the kind of muscle-deep preparedness the samurai lifestyle demanded. Even in dreams, you were never unarmed. You were merely paused. So tonight, as your breaths lengthen and your body warms beneath the cake butin, your sword lies beside you, quiet and still. It hasn't moved, but its presence is alive, pulsing faintly like the final note of a song. You rest not in spite of the blade, but because of it. And maybe, just maybe, it rests because of you. By now, your yukata has softened with your breath, your katana hums its quiet tune of trust beside you, and all that remains is the gentle embrace of your bed, if you can call it that. Because unlike the towering mattresses and plush pillows you might know, your bed tonight is made of cotton, fabric, and intention. It's a futon, and it lives not on a frame, but on the very floor of your room, layered with care and steeped in quiet elegance. The samurai didn't sleep on elevated beds. No ornate four-poster frame, no bouncing coils. Just tatami mats, the woven straw floors that covered every good room in a samurai home. Over those tatami came the shikibuten, the lower layer of the futon system. A thick, rectangular mattress filled with cotton batting or sometimes wool, rolled out each night like a sleepy ritual, soft enough to cushion you, firm enough to remind you that honor doesn't come from luxury. On top of the shikibuten came the cakebuten, the comforter. Stuffed with more cotton or layered fabrics, it varied in thickness depending on the season. Winter cakebuten were denser, sometimes lined with flannel or wool, while summer ones might be lighter than your dignity after a failed poetry recital. The bedding wasn't decorative or excessive, it was functional, but with a sort of quiet beauty. Subtle dyes, hand-stitched edges, and fabrics selected for breathability, softness, and warmth all came together like a perfectly tuned haiku. Short, simple, and deeply felt. Setting up the futon each night wasn't a chore, it was a rhythm. A samurai might not do it himself, especially if he lived with family or servants, but he'd know how to. Roll out the shikibuten, smooth it by hand, lay the cakebuten folded at the end. If it was particularly cold, an extra quilt might be added, or a hot stone wrapped in cloth tucked near the feet. No fuss. Just the calm choreography of someone preparing to surrender to sleep like it's another kind of duel, one you plan to win peacefully. Your pillow, the makura, is smaller than what you might expect, sometimes even a hard lacquered block, though more often filled with buckwheat hulls, dried beans, or cloth scraps. The support helped keep your carefully arranged hair intact, especially if you were still rocking that samurai top knot. But more than vanity, it promoted spinal alignment and muscle readiness. You were supposed to wake up not groaning, but ready to swing a sword or compose a tanka. Or both, depending on the morning. Now, here's a fringe detail you might not expect. Some samurai slept with their heads near the takanoma, the raised alcove in the sleeping chamber that displayed seasonal art or sacred objects. It wasn't for practical reasons. More a gesture of respect. By placing your head near the symbols of your household's aesthetic soul, you reminded yourself, even half asleep, that you lived for something greater than yourself. A plum blossom painting, a polished stone, or a simple ink scroll could be your nightlight, watching over you more gently than any sword. As for room layout, it was minimal by modern standards. Maybe a small chest for personal items, a lamp stand, a water basin for morning face rinsing. That's it. No clutter, no distractions. Even your futon was folded and stored in the closet ashiire every morning, leaving the room pristine by day. A transformation space, rest chamber at night, meditation chamber by morning, and meeting space when needed. Your bed wasn't permanent. It was seasonal, cyclical. A symbol of impermanence that Zen monks would definitely nod at approvingly. And here's something a little off the beaten scroll. There's evidence that some samurai families stitched tiny amamori protective charms into the corners of their futons. Not flashy, just small blessings for health, good dreams, or safety. You might never know they were there unless you tugged the seams apart. But they were felt, like whispered, lullabies sewn into the fabric of sleep itself. Now, not everyone had the same futon experience. Wealthier samurai enjoyed thicker layers, silk coverings, and seasonally rotated bedding. Their futons were aired daily in the sun, yes, laid out on verandas like sleepy clouds basking in the warmth, because mold was the eternal enemy of peaceful slumber. Poorer samurai or city retainers sometimes had thinner bedding or shared sleeping spaces with other family members. But no matter the means, the futon was treated with a kind of solemn gratitude. This was the one place where you could truly put down the weight of the world and of your weapons. Historians still argue whether samurai homes had standardized bedding by the Edo period or whether regional styles persisted stubbornly. Some point to Kyoto's influence spreading uniformity. Others claim local materials and customs held sway longer than we think. Either way, the essence remained. The futon was not a luxury, but a deeply human solution. Foldable, breathable, quietly dignified. A physical pause button. And if you ever had to sleep away from home, visiting another castle, attending court, or stuck traveling for duty, you'd bring a portable futon with you or sleep on a thinner mat called a yabin rolled out in an inn's guest room. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. You could still nestle in with your yukata, your sword nearby, and maybe one eye open just in case your host got any treasonous ideas in the night. Tonight, though, you're home. The futon is familiar, just soft enough. Your body settles into it, with the memory of 1,000 previous nights. The cotton sighs under your weight, and the cake button drapes over you like a story you've already read but still love to hear again. It doesn't brag, doesn't smother, doesn't pretend to be more than it is, and that's exactly why it works. It's a nest, not a fortress. A pause, not an escape. And for a samurai, that's more than enough. Just as your body has finally surrendered to the futon and your katana lies gleaming in the hush beside you, there's another presence woven into the night, a quiet rhythm of footsteps, soft murmurs, and the occasional clink of armor not worn for battle, but for duty. Because while you may drift toward dreams of plum blossoms and whispered haiku, not everyone in a samurai household gets to sleep at once. Someone has to stay awake. Someone has to listen to the dark. This is the realm of the yakanbin, the midnight watchmen. These weren't always professional guards. You and your fellow samurai took turns, rotating night duty like it was just another part of the code. Fire was the great fear of feudal Japan. Entire neighborhoods of wooden homes could vanish in a blaze faster than a duel gone sideways. So every samurai compound or castle kept at least one eye open at night, not for invading armies necessarily, but for the small ember that might undo years of peace in minutes. If you lived in a jakamachi, a castle town, you'd hear the hayashigi, those iconic wooden clappers, echoing faintly through the night. Tap tap, pause, tap tap, a sound designed to reassure and alert at the same time. The night watch was making rounds, reminding citizens to extinguish flames and check their hearths. The message was simple but effective. Someone is watching. Please don't burn down the city. And yes, it worked most of the time. Inside samurai residences, especially larger ones, household staff or lower-ranked warriors often pulled the short straw for night patrols. This meant quiet walking. Lantern in hand, sword at hip, mind alert but never panicked. You weren't looking for invaders from another clan. You were listening for creaks, sniffing for smoke, watching for the glint of something out of place. Sometimes, a child's footstep in the corridor was more nerve-wracking than an enemy scout. And if you were the one sleeping instead of patrolling, your rest was always tinged with this invisible thread of tension. Not quite fear, more like practiced alertness. Like a hunter dozing beside a campfire, one ear always tuned to the forest. You never fully turned off. You just dialed the volume down and trusted your comrades to keep the shadows honest. There's a strange poetry to this. Imagine it, the moon hanging pale outside a paper window, your breath forming small clouds against the cold, and somewhere in the compound, a loyal soul is pacing, shoulders hunched, candle swaying with each careful step. He might hum a song softly under his breath or whisper sutras to ward off sleep, not because he's scared, but because forgetting, even for a minute, could be deadly. And you, nestled in your futon, sleep more deeply because he's out there. Not all watches were equal. In castles, patrols followed complex shift schedules. The dog shift, around midnight, was dreaded, your body cold, your belly empty, your mind haunted by every creak and gust. You'd log your patrol times, note anything strange, and pass the lantern to the next shift like it was a relay race against fate. Some castles even had internal fire towers with bells ready to alert the whole complex. If one rang, you didn't grab a pillow, you grabbed a bucket, or your spear. Historians still argue whether these night shifts were more ceremonial than effective, especially during long periods of peace in the Edo era. Was it truly about security or just reinforcing discipline? Maybe both. The samurai mind couldn't afford to soften, even in slumber, so staying up to patrol, even when no threat loomed, was like sharpening a blade that hadn't yet seen blood. There's a lesser-known practice that deserves attention. Some senior samurai households posted guards not just inside the compound, but also outside the sleeping chamber. Not as an ego move, but out of caution. Poisonings, silent assassins, even vengeful ghosts were all within the realm of possibility, or at least anxiety. So placing a retainer outside the sliding door gave a layer of reassurance. That, and someone to blame if things went sideways in the night. And then there were the fire watchers on rooftops. Yes, on rooftops. Especially in crowded Edo neighborhoods, agile men would patrol rooflines with little lanterns and wide eyes. They weren't just looking for trouble, they were daring it to show itself. And when it did, their cries would echo down the alleys, the clang of alarm gongs would join the fray, and the whole block might be up in minutes, hauling buckets from wells like their lives depended on it, which honestly they did. Back inside your room, sleep continues in quiet waves. You shift slightly, perhaps dreaming of falling from a cliff into a giant bowl of miso soup. It happens. Outside your room, a watchman adjusts his grip on the lantern, checks the shadows, and maybe steals a bite of cold rice tucked in his sleeve. The candle flame flickers. A dog barks in the distance. Everyone notices it, but no one panics. There's comfort in knowing you're not alone in your vulnerability. Even the strongest swordsman can't fight a fire or stop a falling beam while unconscious. But knowing that someone, several someones, are out there, pacing and watching makes sleep possible. Not perfect, but enough. And sometimes, when it was your turn to stand the watch, you'd find peace in it too. The quiet gave you time to think. Maybe you composed verses in your head or counted the stars above the gatehouse. Maybe you thought about your ancestors, or about that merchant's daughter who looked your way at the last festival. Or maybe, just maybe, you stood in the silence, feeling the weight of your duty settle in your chest like a second heart. The samurai night wasn't entirely restful, but it was guarded. Layered with vigilance, community, and soft rituals meant to keep disaster at bay just a little longer. And tonight, lucky you get to be the one who sleeps. The watchman turns the corner, lantern bobbing like a firefly. The wind sighs through the pines. and the tatami beneath you is warm from your breath. You'll sleep a little deeper knowing the night itself is being watched. Your head settles deeper into the Makura tonight, but this isn't the kind of pillow that welcomes you with clouds of fluff and memory foam comfort. No, this is a samurai's pillow, and like everything in your life, even your sleep posture is part ritual, part discipline, and part stubborn practicality. The Makura beneath you might be filled with buckwheat hulls, or even a carved wooden block wrapped in soft cloth. It's not here to cuddle you. It's here to support you, and maybe keep your hair from looking like a bird's nest come morning. Let's talk shape first. Samurai pillows were often narrow and firm, more like neck supports than head-cushioning marshmallows. Some were even shaped like a small wooden stand with a curved upper edge, wrapped in soft cloth or stuffed fabric. These takamikura, or high pillows, didn't just prop your head. They suspended it slightly above the futon, maintaining alignment and balance, especially if your hairstyle took an hour to arrange and another hour to mentally justify. It wasn't just about vanity, though let's be honest. The Chanmage top knot didn't maintain itself without help. Sleeping on your side or flattening your head could ruin the whole shape, and in a society where appearance reflected discipline, messy hair in the morning might signal sloppy spirit. So you used a pillow that preserved structure, and your spine, and possibly your reputation. Some pillows were stuffed with buckwheat hulls or millet husks. These made a soothing rustle when you shifted your weight, like a sack of sleepy sand. The beauty of this design was its adjustability. You could knead the pillow a little, shape it under your neck, and find just the right dip. They kept cool, too, which mattered on humid summer nights when even your eyelids felt sweaty. And because the contents were organic, they were refillable and replaceable, like nature's version of adjustable bedding. Now, here's a quirky twist. Some samurai, especially during long campaigns or extended travels, would use arm pillows instead, literally folding one arm under their head while lying on their side, not out of preference, but necessity. When you're sleeping outdoors, or in a cramped guest house with no spare bedding, sometimes your best pillow is your own bicep. Strong warriors had strong deltoids, and honestly, after a few nights, the body adapts. Sort of. Historians still argue whether high pillows like the takamikura were used widely among all classes of samurai, or whether they were more of a high-ranking fashion imported from courtiers and nobles. Some suggest regional variation, with Kanto warriors opting for practicality and Kyoto elites leaning into aesthetics. The record's murky, but what's clear is that every samurai took bedtime posture seriously, because sleeping wrong could mean waking up with a crick in your neck, or worse, a weak sword arm. Sleeping posture wasn't left to chance either. You were expected to lie on your back or on your side with arms folded neatly or resting atop your chest. No starfish sprawls, no belly flop slumbers. Discipline didn't end at sunset. It just went horizontal. Parents trained children early to sleep neatly without wriggling or tossing, because a still sleeper was considered a calm soul. And in a culture that prized stillness, your nighttime behavior was just another mirror of your inner balance. There was also a practical reason to keep posture controlled: easy readiness. If danger arose, a fire, a thief, or a clan rival looking for trouble, you needed to move swiftly from sleep to stance. Rolling over 10 times before finding your feet would make you laughable at best, dead at worst. So samurai trained their bodies to sleep with the sword hand free, legs bent just enough to spring, and eyes attuned to sudden changes in light or air pressure. Paranoid? Maybe, but effective. A fringe tidbit for you: some martial arts schools reportedly taught sleeping kata. No, not pillow fights, but specific ways to position your limbs, so you could roll or rise into combat faster. It might sound like bedtime cosplay, but in a world where assassination was a legit career path, being able to go from nap to ninja mattered. And while we're in the realm of subtle comforts, let's talk pillow sense. Occasionally, pillows were infused with herbal sachets, dried mugwort, camphor leaves, or even cloves. Not enough to knock you out like a potion, but enough to mask sweat and promote calm breathing. Think of it as proto-aromatherapy without the spa music. Your Macura might smell faintly of the forest or the tea cupboard. Or in summer, a touch of mosquito-repelling herbs tucked discreetly under the pillow wrap. If you were sick or recovering from battle, a special pillow might be used. Firmer, cooler, or slightly elevated to help with breathing or circulation. Old samurai texts mention rest pillows or ill pillows, and these were often made from smoother woods or padded cloth bundles. If you were really fortunate, your household physician would adjust your bedding arrangement nightly based on your pulse and complexion. A personalized sleep plan without the monthly subscription. And here's something you'd never guess. Sometimes, pillows were treated as heirlooms. A particularly well-crafted Macura, especially one used by a revered ancestor, might be passed down through generations. Not because it had sentimental value, though it might, but because it worked. If it was good enough for grandfather Hirotaka, it's good enough for your stiff-neck Tetsuo. Functional legacy is very on-brand for a samurai. Tonight, though, it's just you, your Macura, and the soft hush of a paper lantern fading low. Your head rests gently, your neck relaxed, your breathing even. The pillow may feel strange at first, firmer than you're used to, smaller than you'd expect. But there's something reassuring about its precision. Like it knows just what to do. You're not here to be pampered. You're here to be restored. And as your muscles ease into quiet, you notice something subtle. The room no longer feels like a place you sleep in, it feels like a place that sleeps with you. Every object still, every draft accounted for. Even the pillow seems to exhale with you, creaking softly like bamboo in the wind. You shift once, then not again. Because when sleep is treated as a form of art, posture is the frame, and the pillow is the quiet pedestal that holds your head just high enough to dream with dignity. You're not alone in this quiet house. Somewhere behind a thin sliding door, in a smaller tatami room warmed by a brazier and softened by dim candlelight, there's a pair of tiny feet poking out from under a futon. A sleepy head nestled against a miniature pillow, wrapped in layers of cotton so snug it looks more like a silkworm cocoon than a child's bedding. These are the little samurai, the sons and daughters of warriors, and their journey into the realm of dreams begins early, with discipline tucked in right alongside the bedtime blanket. In a samurai household, children weren't simply expected to grow, they were expected to grow right. And that meant starting their training well before they ever learned to draw a sword. Sleep, like all things in the warrior life, wasn't just about rest. It was about structure, rhythm, and endurance. From the moment they could toddle across the floor, young samurai were introduced to bedtime rituals that would quietly shape them into balanced, alert, and humble people. Or so their elders hoped. You might imagine a serene nighttime routine full of lullabies and warm milk. But no, things looked a little different here. For one, bedtime was early. Very early. As sunset painted the sky in soft gradients of indigo and fire, the younger members of the household were already washing their hands, rinsing their mouths, and bowing respectfully to elders before disappearing into their chambers. No stalling, no tantrums, at least not openly. Obedience was a virtue, and bedtime was its nightly test. Some families even taught their children to bow to the futon. Yes, really. It sounds funny now, but it was part of the lesson. Show respect to the place that gives you rest, just as you would to a teacher or a blade. Sleep wasn't an escape, it was a privilege, one that prepared you for tomorrow's duties, whether that meant carrying water for the kitchen or copying out a page of the Tale of the Hike with Inkai diligence. Even toddlers had their sleep postures corrected. Lie too sprawled, and you'd feel a gentle hand repositioning your limbs. Curl up too tightly, and someone would whisper to stretch just a little. This wasn't punishment, It was practice. The idea was to train not just the body, but the spirit to rest with poise. Because if you could learn stillness in sleep, you could learn stillness in fear, in hunger, in pain. Sleep became a silent dojo. Now you might be wondering about stories. Did samurai children get bedtime tales? They did, but they weren't always comforting. Instead of princesses and talking animals, they heard legends of brave ancestors, loyal retainers, and cautionary tales of betrayal. One favorite was the story of the faithful Akita dog who waited outside his master's grave for years. Another was about a young warrior who trained so hard he could meditate under a freezing waterfall without flinching. Sweet dreams, right? And yet, the children did sleep soundly. Their worlds were structured, predictable. Warm rice in the evening, careful brushing of teeth with salt and bamboo sticks, then into clean night robes, sometimes with little family crests stitched onto the sleeves, and finally under layered futons that smelled faintly of cedar and soapwort. Even their pillows, smaller, softer versions of adult Makura, were adjusted nightly to keep their growing necks aligned just right. Sometimes, if the night was especially cold, children would sleep together in pairs or threes. Not just for warmth, but for comfort. Whispered conversations about training, or tomorrow's breakfast, or which uncle had the funniest sneeze would drift between them before sleep stole the words away. And nearby, an older sibling or a nanny would sit, listening, perhaps pretending not to hear. Historians still argue whether samurai children truly accepted this kind of regimentation without rebellion, or whether accounts from the time were sanitized to paint a more obedient picture. Diaries and letters suggest both. Some kids were model sleepers by 4 years old. Others snuck out to spy on the moon or poke around the armor chest. And who could blame them? But even mischief had its limits. One quirky bedtime rule in some households forbade children from speaking once they were under the futon. It wasn't superstition exactly, it was about training silence, teaching that the mind, like the mouth, should settle at night. Those who succeeded were praised the next morning as strong-hearted, which, let's be honest, is a pretty tempting reward if you're 5 and crave praise like it's matchai. There were also lullabies, though they were simple, almost chant-like. The melody of Komori Yuta, a song still sung today, might drift from a mother's lips as she rocked a younger child. The words told of faraway fields and peaceful sleep while mother works in the village. Sad, sweet, and strangely grounding. The message beneath it all, your family is here, you are safe. Sleep well. But not all children had their mothers close. In higher-ranking samurai homes, children might be raised largely by nannies or elderly retainers, especially boys destined for leadership. These caretakers followed strict schedules and rarely coddled. A nightmare might be answered with a hand on the shoulder, not a hug but presence. Comfort came through consistency, not softness. It built resilience, or so they believed. There's an odd little detail in some family manuals. Boys were discouraged from sleeping on their stomachs, while girls were often encouraged to sleep on their sides with hands folded neatly. It was all part of shaping character through posture. Boys were being prepared to stand and fight, girls to kneel and serve tea. Harsh, maybe, but in that world, roles were taught young and reinforced gently every night between the folds of a futon. Tonight, the children of the house are tucked in tight, their breathing soft, their dreams innocent or ambitious, depending on their age. One clutches a wooden toy sword under the covers. Another whispers a final goodnight to an unseen ancestor before rolling onto her side. The candle burns lower in the hallway. Footsteps fade, and the hush of sleep settles again like rice chaff drifting through sunlight. It's tempting to think of them as miniature warriors, already hardened, already armored. But in truth, they're just kids, learning how to rest before they're taught how to fight, finding quiet before being trained to speak with purpose, dreaming now, so they'll remember what peace feels like, even when they are older, and peace becomes harder to find. Your eyes finally close, and your breath softens, but somewhere just beyond the sliding door, someone else is very much awake. Dressed not in night robes, but in layered garb that barely rustles with movement. One hand rests loosely on the hilt of a short blade, the other occasionally adjusting a paper lantern or brushing dust from the handle of a wooden spear. This is the Yakanban, the night guard. While the samurai household dreams, this person dreams with their eyes open, watching the dark so others don't have to. Samurai homes weren't fortresses exactly, but they were no stranger to danger either. Rival clans, petty thieves, political grudges, or just a drunk cousin with bad ideas, all were possible nighttime visitors. And so, even in the dead of night, there was always someone awake. Not pacing anxiously, but standing calm, alert, still as a pine in winter. The idea wasn't just to respond to danger, it was to prevent it by simply being there. If you lived in a smaller residence, maybe the night guard was a trusted retainer. Someone who'd served your father and your father's father. They knew every creaking floorboard, every moody hinge, every strange whistle the wind made through the eaves. They moved with quiet precision, checking doors, testing latches, adjusting screens so moonlight fell just right to see shadowed corners. They weren't just guarding your life, they were preserving your peace. In larger estates or castles, though, night watches were more formal. Guards worked in shifts, sometimes 3 per night, to keep themselves from dozing. Watch logs were kept, brief notations on what was seen or heard, even if it was just a stray cat or a teacup knocked over by wind. These entries mattered. A quiet night meant the system worked. An eventful night meant a meeting in the morning, and probably an awkward bow from someone who failed their turn. Some night guards drank a bitter tea brewed from roasted barley or dried leaves, meant to keep the senses sharp. A few chewed raw ginger slices, spicy enough to zap you awake no matter how long the candle burned. Others stood in the cold intentionally, letting the bite of wind keep them upright. Falling asleep on duty wasn't just embarrassing, it was dishonorable. In some households, it could mean dismissal, or worse, punishment with public shame. Historians still argue whether samurai homes truly maintained guards every single night, or only during periods of known danger. Some accounts from the Edo period suggest that, in times of peace, guards were sometimes rotated among younger men more for discipline than necessity. But scrolls from war-torn provinces show consistent records of nighttime security, even including illustrations of guard routes and shift rotations. It's one of those things that changed with politics and with how many enemies your family had made recently. There's also the fringe detail about listening posts within certain homes. These were little alcoves, sometimes above sliding doors or beside storerooms, where a retainer could sit unseen and overhear the nighttime breathing of the house. Not spying exactly, more like audio surveillance, 1600 style. If someone in their futon began murmuring in distress, or if silence suddenly fell where it shouldn't, that was a cue to check in. Subtle, creepy, effective, but the role of night guard wasn't just about the sword. It was about observation, timing, and presence. A good guard knew the sounds of the house like verses in a poem. The slow crackle of the brazier, the drip of water from the stone basin outside, the low thud of a sparrow hopping along the thatched roof, and more importantly, they knew which sounds didn't belong. A rattling latch, a footstep too soft, or the absence of a sound that should be there, like the steady breathing of the family dog who had mysteriously gone silent. And let's not forget, sometimes the danger came from within. Illness, especially sudden fever or night sweats, could creep in like a thief. Night guards often doubled as quiet medics, noticing who stirred too much, who coughed in the dark, who failed to rise for dawn prayers. They might alert the household physician, or quietly place a herbal sachet beside the sick sleeper's futon, before anyone else even woke. In winter, they placed hot stones wrapped in cloth beside entryways, not just to prevent freezing, but to gently warm the air and alert intruders with scent and temperature shifts. And yes, that's as clever as it sounds. A thief stepping into a cold room with a sudden warm patch might pause just long enough for the guard to notice. Imagine that, ambushed by a pocket of heat. Here's a quirky touch you'll like. Some guards left silent markers for one another at shift change, small pebbles stacked in a specific order, or incense sticks laid out with the ash angled just so. These were visual codes. All clear, something moved near the storehouse. Dog barked once, likely a deer. Minimal fuss, maximum clarity, no need to wake the house unless it mattered. And if it mattered, the alarm method was equally subtle, a single sharp tap on the temple bell. Just one, enough to shift everyone into silent readiness. You might think night guards were stoic shadows, and yes, that's partly true, but they also got bored. Some practiced kata in slow motion under the moon. Others composed poems, writing lines into the dirt with the tip of a stick, only for the wind to erase them by morning. One popular game, mentally tracing the layout of the house backward, from the garden to the entry, without opening your eyes. Because if you couldn't map your own home in your mind, how could you protect it? There's something deeply comforting about this, isn't there? Knowing that while you sleep, wrapped in futon layers, head nestled on your buckwheat pillow, someone is just beyond the screen door, holding space between the night and your dreams. Not in a dramatic, armor-clad way, but with quiet alertness. A calm sentry at the edge of the world. Even the soft creak of a floorboard can feel like a lullaby if you know it belongs to someone watching out for you. That flicker of lantern light through rice paper screens isn't an interruption, it's reassurance. Proof that your world is intact, that someone walked the path, checked the locks, breathed the same chilled air, and returned to their post without complaint. Tonight, they make their round again, passing by your door with the gentlest footfall, pausing a moment, listening to your breath, noting the slow rise and fall, the peace in your posture, and then moving on. Lantern bobbing like a slow heartbeat down the corridor, shadow watching shadow, so that you can sleep deeper, dream longer, and wake to a world that still feels safe. The moment your hand pulls the quilted robe tighter and you exhale into the futon, somewhere in the same room, or just beyond a sliding door your armor waits. Not worn, not clanking around in the dark like a ghostly exoskeleton, but close, always close, resting on its stand like a hollowed-out guardian, gazing with unblinking lacquered eyes from its Kabuto helm. You sleep, but it watches. Yes, you were told samurai didn't wear armor to bed, and that's true. No one curls up in a pile of iron scales unless they enjoy waking up with bruises shaped like fish. But the armor wasn't stuffed into closets or forgotten overnight. It held a place of honor, often just within reach. Why? Because danger rarely made appointments. Most samurai kept their gear either in the same room they slept or in a chamber no more than a few steps away. A full set of armor, da, kabuto, coat, Sunny 8 could weigh between 30 and 60 pounds depending on its construction. Too heavy to throw on in a panic, right? That's why readiness wasn't just about the armor, it was about the plan. You knew where every strap lay. You could sling your da over your chest in the dark, one eye half shut, muscle memory doing the talking. And for some warriors, there was a routine before sleep, not unlike tucking in a child. Except this child was a Meadowland silk beast that had saved your life more than once. You might clean the Menpo mask, wiping it free of sweat or blood with a soft cloth soaked in camellia oil. You might realign the cords on your coat so they wouldn't twist overnight. And then you'd place it all carefully onto its stand, a wooden mannequin shaped roughly like a human torso, so that it could rest just like you. There's a strangely intimate rhythm to that, isn't there? You disrobe from your public self, step out of the warrior's shell, and arrange your other body beside you like a sleeping partner. Samurai even named their armor sets, not in an official registry but quietly in their own heads. Black Moon, Cloud Splitter, Echo Shell, because if something protects you from spears, arrows, and the occasional irate farmer, you might develop feelings. Here's a curious detail. Some armor stands had little slotted trays underneath, where charms, protective scrolls, or polished stones were kept. These weren't just decoration. They were spiritual seatbelts, prayers in ink and talismans of iron tucked close to the armor so it didn't lose its fighting spirit overnight. Historians still argue whether these additions held real value or were just ritual comforts, but enough records survive to suggest they were common, even expected, in elite homes. In some households, armor was placed so it faced the doorway. Why? Simple. If someone entered with ill intent, the first thing they'd see was not your sleepy face but the cold, impassive gaze of your battle mask. That alone might be enough to buy you 5 precious seconds, or make them rethink their life choices altogether. There's something universally chilling about a face that doesn't blink, especially when it's made of lacquered steel. And for the especially cautious or paranoid, there were Kitsukyusoku arrangements. That's a fancy way of saying fast assembly sets. These were partial armor kits, sleeves, shin guards, maybe a simple cuirass, pre-strapped or laid out on a mat like a surgeon's tools. They weren't for full combat, but for quick response, enough to defend your family or sprint to the gate before chaos took over. It was the samurai version of sleeping with one eye open. Some warriors even kept a yoroyobai, a special belt wrapped around their waist while they slept, worn beneath the night robe. Not armor itself, but a reminder of duty. A signal to themselves, stay ready, a little uncomfortable. Sure, but not as uncomfortable as being caught without it when you needed it. And while armor slept quietly beside you, it was never far from your mind. Stories circulated of warriors dreaming of their armor, of battles yet to come, or ones they'd barely survived. One fringe tale tells of a samurai who claimed he could hear whispers from his helmet at night, warning him of future danger. Was it guilt, stress, or the product of a long life lived on edge? No one knows, but the helmet stayed close until the day he died. Here's a fun but eyebrow-raising tidbit. In a few regions, samurai who traveled often had folding armor stands they carried with them, packed down into their luggage like a collapsible chair. That way, even in strange inns or mountain huts, they could prop up their armor and sleep under its gaze. Not superstition exactly, just comfort through familiarity. It's hard to rest in a strange bed, but easier when your old battle buddy's right there watching the door. In more ceremonial homes, especially among high-ranking samurai, armor was sometimes displayed behind sheer silk curtains at night. Not to protect it, but to veil its power. Armor wasn't just clothing, it was presence, intimidation, energy. And if you wanted a restful night, you didn't want that energy staring straight at you in the dark. The curtains softened the mood, letting you breathe easier while still knowing it was close. Think of it as tucking your sword under a pillow, and then wrapping the pillow in lavender-scented resolve. You'll appreciate this modern echo. Some martial artists today hang their gi and belt neatly in their bedrooms. Not because they're training at midnight, but because they sleep better knowing who they are is always within reach. That same idea pulses beneath the surface here. Armor beside your futon isn't about paranoia. It's about identity. You aren't just a warrior in the daylight. You're a warrior always, even asleep, even dreaming, tonight. As your eyelids go heavy and your breath finds that slow, steady rhythm, your armor waits. Polished, silent, still holding yesterday's tension in its cords, still whispering the shape of your movements into its plates. It doesn't rest the way you do, it simply pauses, ready for the moment when your feet swing back onto the floor and your fingers know exactly where the first strap goes. Because the truth is, armor doesn't need to sleep. You do, and you sleep better knowing it's nearby. A second skin waiting patiently beside you, not to smother, not to dominate, but to remind you who you are when the sun rises again. Until then, it guards the night in its own quiet way. A metal shadow in a room full of breathing and dreams. You're finally deep in it now. That slow, velvety drift beneath consciousness where the edges blur and logic no longer applies. But even in sleep, your mind doesn't quite let go. You don't stop being a samurai just because your eyes are closed. Instead, the battlefield changes. The sword stays sheathed, but your dreams swing freely. And sometimes they cut deeper than steel ever could. Samurai didn't talk openly about dreams the way poets or priests might. It wasn't really the done thing, not in the tearoom or on patrol, but privately. In quiet moments before the sun returned. Yes, they dreamed. Of course they did. Anyone who's lived through even one skirmish has a theater in their head that never goes dark. Scenes replay, faces return. Sometimes they morph, turn strange, slip sideways into nonsense. You ride a horse that dissolves into mist. A familiar voice calls your name from the mouth of a dragon. Or you wake sweating, sure you've forgotten something vital, except you don't know what. Many samurai recorded their dreams in small journals tucked into lacquered chests or kept folded inside scroll cases. Not elaborate, flowery diaries, but blunt fragments. River turned to fire. Father's voice at the shrine. Sword missing. Some of these are haunting. Others are surprisingly mundane. Missed my footing again on the temple stairs. You get the sense that even the fiercest warriors weren't above dreaming of embarrassment or longing, and then there are the strange recurring themes. Dreams of lost battles they'd never fought. Dreams of impossible reunions, fathers who'd died, brothers never born. One particularly famous general reportedly dreamed, over and over, of a stone lantern falling into a koi pond. Historians still argue whether this symbolized a fear of fading legacy, or if he just really hated koi. It wasn't all nightmares, though. Some dreams were serene. Walking beneath a plum blossom rain. Sitting in silent snowfall beside a fox. Hearing a song their mother sang once when they were too young to remember the words. These moments are found scattered in haiku, buried in family records, or mentioned briefly in letters written just before battle. You get the sense they were treasured, tiny sanctuaries that appeared when the world finally let its grip loosen. One quirky belief, especially common during the Edo period, was that the first dream of the new year, called Hatsayum, could predict your fortune for the coming 12 months. Seeing Mt. Fuji, a hawk, or an eggplant, yes, really was considered lucky. There's still no scholarly consensus on why eggplants made the list. Some say it was a play on words. Others think it symbolized abundance. Or maybe it was just the 1600s equivalent of seeing a golden retriever wearing sunglasses, an omen of good vibes. More mysterious were the dreams of ancestral guidance. A figure standing in the mist, offering a nod or turning away. You'd wake unsure if you'd been blessed or warned. Some samurai believed ancestors could visit during sleep only if your soul was quiet enough to receive them. So they practiced dream discipline, breathing rituals before bed, sleeping in a particular direction, usually with the head facing north or east, and keeping certain talismans nearby to ward off chaos and invite clarity. One well-preserved example comes from a letter written by a samurai to his cousin. Last night I saw our grandfather beside the bridge near Jin. He said nothing, only pointed to the trees. I think the message is clear. We must not take the inland road. Did he obey? Did it save him? The letter doesn't say, but the fact that it was written at all tells you how seriously they took these messages from beyond the veil of sleep. Not every dream made sense, of course. One scroll preserved in a Kyoto archive features a list of dreams scribbled by a retainer named Tsunemoto over 30 nights. They include: cat with 3 legs spoke in Chinese, armor filled with bees, and stood naked before the shogun while reciting poetry badly. Even 17th century brains enjoyed a little absurdity. And then there's the dark corridor of dreams, the ones you try not to remember. Visions of fallen comrades standing upright again. the face of someone you killed who refuses to stay dead in your mind's theater. These weren't poetic dreams. These were reckonings. No amount of ritual could always keep them at bay. Some samurai believed these were not dreams at all, but moments when the soul wandered too far and brushed against unfinished karma. To calm the night, some warriors tied thin paper charms, yumemori, to the corners of their futon. These weren't elaborate spells, just a few brush strokes of hopeful intent, protection from restless spirits, a night free of haunting. Sometimes these were burned the next morning if the dream had been especially bad, as if sending the images into smoke might scatter them for good. Dream interpretation wasn't exactly a formal science, but there were guides written for it. Slim, handwritten books passed between scholars and monks, listing symbols and their possible meanings. Dream of falling equals shame or regret. Dream of flying equals ambition ungrounded. Dream of being chased equals unresolved duty. They weren't universal, of course. One samurai might wake from a dream of drowning feeling terrified, while another would interpret it as a baptism of courage. Historians still argue whether these books shape dreams, or if the dreams shape the books. There's one strange belief that appears only in a few obscure temples, that a samurai could use dreams as training grounds, that the clarity and discipline cultivated during waking hours could stretch into sleep, that with enough focus, one could fight battles, make decisions, and even reconcile enemies within the fabric of a dream. Was it real, or just wishful thinking from those who longed for control in a world where death often arrived from behind? Either way, there's something haunting and human about that hope, that the mind might become a dojo, that rest might also be preparation, that even in dreams you were never off duty. Not entirely. Even now, as your breath slows and your muscles surrender to gravity, the mind wanders, but it never truly forgets the weight of the sword at your side or the sound of footsteps behind you. Tonight, perhaps you'll dream of a river that runs uphill, or of fireflies in the shape of kanji. Maybe you'll hear your father's voice whispering advice that only makes sense when you wake, or maybe you'll find yourself in a field where nothing bad ever happened. The wind smells of pine and miso. Your armor isn't needed here, but you wear it anyway, just in case. Your eyes are closed, your limbs softened into the mattress of straw and cloth, but your hand still knows exactly where the sword lies. It's not buried under your pillow like some swashbuckling bedtime fantasy. That would be both impractical and extremely bad for your neck, but it's never far, just an arm's reach away. Leaning against the wall, resting across a stand, or nestled in a purpose-built lacquer box, subtle, dignified, and deadly. Because a samurai without a blade is like a tea ceremony without the tea, form without function. You don't sleep with your katana, you sleep next to it. There's a difference. One is paranoid, the other is prepared. Most commonly, you'd find a short sword, a wakizashi, closer to the bed than the longer katana. Why? 2 reasons. 1, it's easier to wield indoors where low ceilings and sliding screens don't make for ideal sword-swinging real estate. And 2, it was always with you anyway. The wakizashi, sometimes called the companion blade, was the sword you never removed in polite company, even when you had to leave the katana at the door. Sleeping next to it wasn't just tradition, it was expectation. Some samurai even developed little nighttime habits around their blades, a light polishing with rice paper, whispered thanks for surviving the day. You didn't sharpen your sword at night, that was considered unlucky, but you could recheck the wrapping on the hilt, the tightness of the Seigyo cord, or the clean line of the scabbard's lacquer. These were gestures of both care and control. Like checking the lock twice before bed. You might also lay your blade so the hilt pointed toward your dominant hand, resting just beyond the edge of your futon. Not pointing at the door, that could be considered aggressive, but definitely ready to draw. Quick access was the point, not theatrics. If someone did break in, you didn't want to spend 5 seconds fumbling like a dropped spoon in the dark. And then there's the tanto, the smallest blade in the samurai's arsenal. Less sword, more dagger. Often hidden, often personal. It was favored by some for its ease of concealment and quick use in confined spaces. Occasionally, you'd find a tanto resting beneath the pillow, especially in wartime or in unfamiliar territory. But again, more for comfort than for stabbing someone in your sleep. There's even a case recorded in the journals of a traveling samurai who kept a tanto tucked inside the roll of his bedding, secured with a knot that could be undone in a single pull. That way, even if someone tried to grab him while he slept, he could roll toward his weapon instinctively. Fringe behavior? Maybe, but when you've seen how fast peace can end, you start sleeping like a chessboard, always thinking one move ahead. In larger homes, weapons weren't always scattered across the floor like some medieval game of pick-up sticks. There were dedicated stands, wall hooks, even built-in compartments hidden behind sliding panels. A beautifully carved sword rack near the sleeping area wasn't a display, it was practical architecture. Think of it as the 17th century equivalent of a bedside drawer with a flashlight and your car keys. And let's not forget the naginata. Less common for male samurai at night, but often present in the quarters of Onobu geisha, female warriors. A naginata leaned in the corner could defend a home as effectively as any sword. With its reach and sweeping blade, designed to turn narrow hallways into choke points, samurai women, especially those left to defend castles while the men were away, knew their weapons and kept them close. You didn't need to be in armor to be ready. You just needed resolve, and maybe a really sharp polearm. Here's a lesser-known detail. During certain periods, samurai were required by law to carry their swords even during travel or relocation, which meant that if you were on the road, your sword didn't just lie beside you, it slept with you, wrapped in the same cloth bundle as your clothes and rice balls. You might even use it as a kind of barrier between yourself and strangers if lodging in communal spaces. A polite signal of I value my personal space, and also my arteries. One document from the Tokugawa era describes a samurai who refused to sleep more than 5 paces away from his katana, even while recovering from a fever. He had it hung from the rafters with a loop of braided horsehair, so it hovered above him like some iron guardian angel. Unusual. Sure, but when questioned, he simply replied, "The blade and I breathe together." That's commitment, or possibly mild delirium. What's more interesting is how the presence of a sword shaped your sleep. You didn't toss and turn wildly when a 2-foot blade rested beside you. You learned to sleep still, calm, a kind of nightly zazen where your body became as composed as your thoughts. Because reaching for your sword in the dark isn't just a reaction, it's a test of poise, of awareness, and maybe deep down of identity. Historians still argue whether samurai actually needed to sleep with such proximity to their weapons during peaceful eras like the Edo period, or whether it was just ritual clinging to older times. Maybe it was both, a practical security measure and a symbolic gesture. I am who I am, even in dreams. That kind of thing. One final oddity. Some temples trained warrior monks, Sohei, to sleep in shifts with short spears clutched loosely across their chests, one hand curled around the haft even in unconsciousness. This practice may have influenced certain samurai households to adopt similar habits, though toned down a bit for the lacquered futon crowd. Still, the idea that the body could be trained to rest without surrendering readiness was deeply appealing. A fusion of the martial and the meditative. So now, as you lie there, wrapped in night stillness, think of the sword resting in the dark. Not a threat, not a burden, just a reminder you are not helpless in the dark. Your instincts run deeper than dreams. The steel sleeps light, and so do you. The night feels soft and timeless. You've drifted down into dreams of whispering rivers and moonlit fields, but outside your paper-thin walls, the world still turns, and not always peacefully. There's always the chance, small but real, that something shifts in the dark. A thief, a rival, a hungry stray dog with more curiosity than manners. Which is why no samurai household truly lets its guard down, even after the lamps are blown out. That silent, peaceful sleep you've earned. It's balanced by layers of subtle defense because everyone knows that peace is a mask that history likes to tug at randomly. And you don't get caught with your eyes closed, not if you want to keep them. First, the floors themselves help you out. You roll over with a yawn and maybe a groan, but if anyone else tries to creep down that hallway, they're not going anywhere unnoticed. Enter the Yugwasubari, or nightingale floor, a type of creaky wooden floorboard engineered to chirp softly under pressure. Not a loud squeak, but a high, eerie warble like a bird whose song is just slightly off-key. It's elegant, it's maddening, and it's impossible to sneak past. These floors were common in castles and high-ranking samurai residences, where they weren't just decorative features, but security systems disguised as poetry. Any intruder foolish enough to slink barefoot through the night ended up triggering a sound that alert ears had been trained to recognize instantly. And yes, this means you probably developed the ability to distinguish between the creak of a floorboard and, say, the scurry of a mouse. That's how finely tuned your ears became. But floors weren't the only layer. There was always a system in place. Households often rotated nighttime watch duty among retainers. One unlucky soul kept his eyes open while the rest floated through dreams of plum blossoms and awkward battle speeches. The position was usually called yakanban, and it wasn't glamorous. You didn't wear armor. You carried a short weapon and maybe a lantern if the wind wasn't too harsh. Your job was to listen, breathe quietly, and be ready. And don't forget the dogs. Not pets, not really, more like colleagues with paws. Fiercely loyal, trained to bark at strangers but remain silent with household members. Some samurai kept one tied just outside the sleeping quarters, not for cuddles but for early warnings. A whine meant nothing. A growl meant something. A sudden silence, possibly the worst sound of all. Some homes went further with passive traps. A thin tray of pebbles placed beneath the outer shoji door. A layer of ash spread across the entry walkway. You'd notice any shift, any smear or misplaced footprint. And if things were serious, there were spikes concealed under loose floor mats near high-value areas, not deadly, but enough to discourage bad choices. Historians still argue whether these traps were common practice or just folklore exaggerated by bored guards. But a few surviving blueprints hint that yes, some clever minds really did weaponize architecture. One delightful oddity, there were household codes, simple but strange nightly call-and-response games. The head of the house might murmur a phrase from a poem, and the night guard would have to respond with the next line. Get it wrong, and someone starts unsheathing metal. It's like literary two-factor authentication. But what if you were the only one home? What if you were traveling, alone in an inn with only your weapon and instincts? Then you adapted. You'd sleep with your head toward the door, never your feet, never your back. You'd wedge a coin or small object into the sliding panel so it clicked when moved, or tie a thin thread between door frame and futon edge. If it snapped, you were up. No questions asked. It was a low-tech security system, but incredibly effective. You didn't need lasers when you had paranoia and string. Some warriors even practiced half-sleep, a skill learned from battlefield conditions. One part of the brain rested while another remained alert, ready to snap to full wakefulness at the faintest hint of change. A breeze that wasn't there before. A breath too close. A shadow where none should be. Not all samurai mastered it, but the best of them could wake without the panic, stepping into action before their thoughts even caught up. And here's a fringe tidbit. One remote mountain clan supposedly trained their retainers to detect the presence of another human in the room while still asleep, claiming it was an ability rooted in spiritual sensitivity. There's no hard proof for this, just some eerie records and exaggerated family scrolls. But the idea caught on in whispers. The belief that you could feel danger like a ripple in the air, even with your eyes shut. You'd be surprised how much of nighttime defense came down to sound. Not violence, not brute strength, but awareness. The clink of armor that shouldn't be there. The shuffle of a heel instead of a toe. Even the scent of oil on an unfamiliar blade could raise the hairs on the back of your neck if you were tuned enough. Because when you've lived through ambushes, you stop trusting peace completely. It becomes more of a truce. A nap between storms. And if, heaven forbid, someone did breach all those barriers and make it to your sleeping room, you wouldn't leap dramatically into the air and grab your katana like a stage play. You'd roll, low and silent, grabbing your wakizashi by the hilt and your breath by the throat. You'd let your attacker cross just one more step into your rhythm before acting. That's not just instinct. That's training burned into the marrow. But you'd hope, really, that none of it was needed. That the night passed gently. That the floorboards sang no song. That the dog stretched and snored, bored by the lack of drama. That the night guard had the luxury of finishing his rounds without a single sword drawn. Because that kind of boring night, that's the dream. That's the version of samurai life no one writes ballads about, but every warrior quietly hopes for. So tonight, as you lie in stillness, blade resting where it always does, floor beneath you whispering its protection, remember this. You are watched over not just by warriors and weapons, but by traditions older than you can name. They hum in the beams above you. They settle in the ash by the door. They breathe with you quietly until the sun returns. The room is dim now, shadows tucked into every corner, and even the candle's final breath has melted into wax. You listen, eyes closed, to the soft rhythms of the night. But not all of those sounds belong to the crickets. Somewhere to your left, there's a snore, a low, buzzing hum like a bee trapped inside a teacup. Not dramatic, not disruptive, just steady, familiar, welcome. Even the most disciplined warrior can't stop his nose from whistling when sleep claims him. Yes, samurai snored. You may have imagined them sleeping in statuesque silence, backs perfectly straight, breath barely perceptible like monks in meditation. And sure, some tried to keep that image alive. But real life doesn't care much for silent myths. Especially after a day of intense physical training, political scheming, and probably more fermented fish than the average stomach appreciates. The sleeping chambers, especially in larger homes, were not solitary sanctuaries. Not always. Unless you were at the very top of the social pyramid, or deeply antisocial, you likely shared a room with at least one other person. A retainer, a family member, a servant posted discreetly near the door. That means sleep wasn't just a personal experience, it was a social one, and that meant dealing with each other's night sounds. Breathing, coughs, sudden turns of the body against straw mats, and yes, snoring, but there were rules. Cultural expectations helped contain the chaos. Making too much noise during the night was seen as a lack of self-control. Fidgeting excessively, weak mind, letting out a loud, theatrical yawn during the early part of the night. That could be considered offensive if others were still awake. You were supposed to dissolve quietly into sleep, not stage a soundscape. Even the pillows were designed to help manage sleep posture. Samurai used a takamekura, a kind of wooden or lacquered headrest padded with a small cloth roll, designed to keep the neck aligned and the elaborate hairstyle untouched. It wasn't what you'd call cozy by modern standards, but it encouraged stillness. You didn't toss and turn if your head was balanced on something that might tip over. And stillness meant silence. Now, if you snored too loudly, there wasn't a whole lot someone could do about it, short of gently nudging you or rolling you onto your side, though that was more common among family than fellow warriors. In barracks or group lodging situations, tolerance became a virtue. You put up with the occasional midnight wheeze because chances are you'd contribute your own tomorrow night. And no one wanted to be that guy who made a fuss over normal human noise. Still, there were ways to quiet things down. Herbal remedies were sometimes used, Infusions of chamomile or licorice root meant to calm the breath and open the nasal passages. Sleep teas weren't just for nobles or monks. Some samurai cultivated their own calming mixtures, steeped before bed and served with a side of ancient folk wisdom. One popular phrase went, "Drink gently to sleep soundly," or "Drink too much and sleep beside your regrets." That probably sounds better in classical Japanese, but the meaning holds. There's a fascinating fringe belief that certain samurai train themselves not just to sleep lightly, but to breathe without making a sound. This practice, rooted partly in meditative traditions and partly in pure vanity, involved timing breath with the rise and fall of the night air. To breathe like a tree in winter, one manual supposedly describes. The goal wasn't just silence, but invisibility. As if becoming undetectable, even in slumber, made you closer to the ideal warrior. Whether it actually worked or was just ego wrapped in incense smoke remains open for debate. Historians still argue whether communal sleeping arrangements among samurai were the norm outside of campaigns, or just a result of Edo period frugality. Some records suggest even mid-ranking warriors preferred solitary sleeping spaces when they could afford them, especially to preserve dignity and reduce the potential for embarrassing late-night mutterings. But others indicate that sharing a room, especially with your page or personal attendant, was common enough to be considered routine. And speaking of mutterings, samurai talked in their sleep. They weren't immune to dreams that spilled over into the audible world. Old poems mumbled half-consciously, a muttered name, the occasional battle cry, especially in veterans. These moments were usually ignored out of politeness, but sometimes they were noted and joked about the next morning. One famous diary entry describes a retainer who shouted "Cut the eel first!" in his sleep, causing an entire room to wake up confused and mildly hungry. Then there were the sleepwalkers. Rare but real. One particularly bizarre story tells of a samurai who rose in the night, walked outside into the garden, and began practicing his sword forms in perfect silence under the moonlight, still fully asleep. He didn't wake until he stepped into the koi pond. His family watched in hushed amazement and then decided, understandably, to tie a bell to his ankle for future nights. Sleep, after all, wasn't just physical recovery. It was spiritual ground as well. Dreams carried messages, sometimes from ancestors, sometimes from unresolved guilt, sometimes from that very spicy miso soup you probably shouldn't have eaten so late. A particularly vivid dream might be recorded in a private scroll or shared in hushed tones with a trusted monk or advisor the next day. Last night, I dreamt my blade rusted in the rain. What do you think it means? The answer, more often than not, was, stay out of the rain. But occasionally, such dreams led to real-life decisions, delayed travel, altered alliances, rescheduled meetings, all because of a whisper in the night. Now, not everyone dreamt quietly. Some let out soft gasps or sighs, releasing the pressure of daytime honor through the breath of night. The samurai world was built on control, discipline, stillness. But inside the dreaming body, those boundaries could melt like snow on a temple roof, just for a little while. And if you were lucky enough to sleep beside someone you trusted, a spouse, a comrade, a child, you might even murmur to them, half dreaming, half awake, words that made no sense, or maybe too much sense. Those brief, soft exchanges folded into the silence of the night and vanished before the roosters stirred. Gone like dew on iron. So tonight, as your own breath slows and your muscles melt deeper into sleep, let the quiet sounds of a warrior's rest wrap around you. A distant breath, a creaking floor that means nothing, the weight of tradition sleeping soundly beside you, and if you snore, it's fine. Somewhere in the past, a samurai probably did too, right after drinking too much barley tea and whispering to his sword like an old friend. Your body is still, but your mind drifts into something stranger than silence. something weightless. Sleep pulls you deeper, not just into rest, but into a place the samurai never dismissed as random imagination. Dreams, for them, weren't idle play. They were maps, messages, sometimes even warnings. And as you glide through your own dreamland tonight, know that your counterparts centuries ago treated these nighttime visions with the kind of respect modern folks usually reserve for doctors' notes and weather alerts. Samurai culture was laced with layers of belief: Buddhist, Shinto, animist, ancestral, and each one had a little something to say about what dreams meant. If you saw water, it might mean peace or trouble depending on its clarity. If you dreamt of a falling tree, it could mean someone powerful would soon die. Seeing your blade snap in a dream, absolutely a bad omen. Wake up, sit quietly, sip some green tea, and maybe cancel that duel. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Many samurai kept Yume no Nikki, dream journals, where they logged strange or vivid dreams. Sometimes they read them aloud to monks or asked fortune tellers to interpret them. Other times, the dreams were reviewed during family council meetings, especially if they involved visions of ancestors. You dream of your great-great-grandfather standing beneath a cherry tree, holding a broken fan. That might send your uncle into a 3-hour meditation session, trying to figure out if that fan was symbolic of political weakness, or if it was just hot in the dream. Dreams of animals were taken especially seriously. A white fox could mean divine protection. A black horse might signal urgency. One oddly specific superstition held that dreaming of eating noodles was a sign your next journey would go smoothly, especially if you slurped them loudly in the dream. Historians still argue whether this noodle prophecy was ever taken seriously, or if it was just an excuse to eat ramen more often before bed. Sometimes, dreams were believed to carry messages from the kami, spiritual beings or forces that drifted between worlds. You didn't always see them clearly in dreams. Sometimes you just knew something had been watching you, judging, smiling, maybe, or warning you without words. Those dreams would haunt you through breakfast, like a shadow that hadn't quite faded with the dawn. And then, of course, came the battlefield dreams. The ones warriors didn't talk about as much in public. The replays of past bloodshed. The echoes of swords and cries that lingered long after the last real fight. You'd wake up gripping your futon, heart pounding like a temple drum, eyes wild until they landed on the familiar wooden beams above. That was the kind of dream you tried not to record. Not unless you wanted to admit that your soul hadn't quite healed from everything it had seen. There was a soft belief that dreaming of a lost comrade meant they were still watching over you, or maybe waiting. Either way, it wasn't something to ignore. Some samurai lit incense the morning after such a dream, whispering quiet prayers as they knelt. Others placed small offerings, rice grains, a folded cloth, or a single flower by the household shrine, just in case their friend needed a little warmth in the afterlife. And in more playful dreams, yes, those existed too, you might find yourself floating through impossible landscapes. Endless bamboo forests, mountains shaped like tigers, rivers that flowed backward while koi fish lectured you about duty. These dreams weren't always symbolic. Sometimes they were just the brain's way of throwing a wild, late-night festival after a day of too much seriousness. A reward, perhaps, for surviving another rigid 24 hours without snapping your fan over someone's head. There's even a peculiar tale of a samurai who dreamt, night after night, that his sword had turned into a spoon. At first, he panicked, thinking it was a sign of disgrace. But eventually, he interpreted it to mean that his path was no longer one of war, but of nourishment and care. He retired shortly after and opened a soba noodle shop. Whether that story is true or just comfortingly poetic is up for debate, but it speaks to the idea that dreams could redirect an entire life. Scholars still argue whether dreams were used politically, whether clan leaders ever fabricated visions to justify alliances or betrayals. The fox spirit came to me last night and told me to marry your daughter. Might sound suspiciously convenient when heard over tea, but in an age where supernatural influence held weight, it's not unthinkable that dreams became a quiet kind of power move. Not just a personal event, but a public narrative tool. You might think that dreaming of your ancestors always meant something important, but it depended on what they were doing. If they sat with you and offered tea, that was good. If they scolded you or turned away, it could mean shame was coming or already here. And if they said nothing at all, that was often worse. Silence in dreams could be louder than a battlefield. It wasn't uncommon for high-ranking samurai to commission small paintings or woodblock prints based on significant dreams. Not for display, but to hold the memory in physical form. Hidden away, sometimes burned in ritual. Other times, left in scrolls beneath floorboards to be found by later generations. Like a whispered message through time. Even in the most rational corners of the samurai mind, dreams had a place. You didn't laugh them off the next morning unless you wanted to be seen as shallow or blind to the hidden layers of life. You approached them with curiosity, humility, and occasionally fear. Because the world of dreams didn't bow to swords or scrolls, it existed above, around, and beneath them. Untouchable, yet intimate. So as you rest tonight and your breath slows into that dreamy rhythm, don't be surprised if an old warrior appears beneath a plum tree and offers you a cryptic proverb about timing and tofu. Or if a fox in silk robes asks you riddles while snow falls sideways. Let it happen. Let the dream unfold like a story already half remembered. Because in the samurai world, dreams weren't separate from reality. They were the silk threads sewn through it. And if you find yourself in a dream duel tonight, just remember, even dream blades are sharp, but so are your instincts. Trust them. Let them guide you through the mist and into the next quiet morning. You picture a fearsome samurai, stiff with honor and responsibility, easing down onto his futon for the night. But just before he can reach his peaceful, incense-scented dreams, a tiny foot collides with his ribcage. That's right. Even the most stoic warrior was not immune to the unpredictable chaos of co-sleeping with children. Because samurai had families too. And kids, well, kids have never cared about your image as a disciplined war machine when they want to cuddle or kick you in the spleen while dreaming about horses. Samurai children, like all kids, slept in whatever arrangement best suited the family's rhythm, needs, and house size. In higher-ranking households, children might have their own sleeping quarters if they were older. But in most homes, younger children often slept in the same room or even the same futon as their parents or caregivers. This wasn't just about love or convenience. It was also about warmth. Japan's nights could get bitterly cold, and those paper-thin shoji walls weren't fooling anyone. Bodies huddled together under shared blankets was practical, not just sweet. A father who had spent his day advising lords, practicing sword forms, and dodging political disaster might finally lay down, only to have a toddler curl into his side, whispering nonsense about butterflies and imaginary enemies in the ceiling beams. And while part of him might wish for a silent night, another part, the quieter, human part, would probably pull the child in closer, because tomorrow the world outside the house might be harsh. But tonight it smelled like rice and sandalwood, and the only threats were tiny fingers poking his nose. The nightly rituals of samurai families weren't that different from modern ones. A light meal, some gentle conversation, possibly a story, often taken from historical legends or Buddhist parables. Fathers, yes, even hardened warriors, would sometimes recount the tale of Minamoto no Yashitsune or the tale of the loyal crane, hoping to lull their children into dreams filled with honor and snowy feathers instead of restless squirming and spontaneous giggling. Spoiler, the giggling usually won. Mothers and nurses played a central role in helping samurai children fall asleep. They were the soothers, the blanket adjusters, the quiet hums in the dark that reassured the child that the outside world could wait until morning. And those women were often the keepers of spiritual sleep traditions too, placing protective charms under pillows, burning small amounts of calming herbs in the corner, or placing symbolic items near the head to ward off nightmares. If a child woke in tears, crying about a shadow or a monster, the mother might recite a charm or press a warm cloth to the forehead while whispering, "It was only a night fox. He's gone now. Sleep again, little moon." You'd be surprised how effective that is. Of course, some homes had more rigid sleeping expectations. There were households where silence was enforced even for children, and where a nighttime outburst might be met with stern correction. But more often, especially in the domestic spaces where formality loosened its grip, children were allowed their sleepy chaos, their night chatter, their wild dreams spoken aloud as they kicked off blankets and tangled themselves in their father's sleeve. There's even a diary from a mid-ranking samurai who writes that his young son rolled off the futon 3 nights in a row, eventually leading to a nighttime solution involving extra straw mats, a rolled-up kimono barrier, and an appeal to Amaterasu herself for 5 minutes of peace. Parent fatigue is eternal. Quirkier traditions peppered childhood sleep as well. Some families believed placing a small toy blade, blunted, of course, beside a child's futon would give them bravery in their dreams. Others tucked miniature fans or wooden animal carvings beside them, invoking good fortune or cleverness. And in rare cases, a child training to become a page or squire might sleep with his future master's discarded sash, as a quiet form of bonding, or just because it smelled like stability and power. Dreams played a part in childhood too, of course. Some parents encouraged their children to tell them their dreams at breakfast, treating them like omens or insights. If a child dreamt of flying cranes, it might be seen as a sign of spiritual openness. If they dreamt of fire, some took it to mean emotional restlessness, or too much grilled eel at dinner. One of the stranger beliefs held that a child who frequently dreamt of running was destined to be a messenger, scout, or poet, which probably says more about how adults interpreted things than the child's actual fate. Historians still argue whether samurai children were trained to interpret dreams themselves or simply reported them for adult analysis. Some texts suggest upper-class children were taught symbolic meaning early, while others point out that dreams were more often handled through the oral traditions of the household. Either way, dreaming was a family affair, not a solitary mystery, even if the dreams were silly. And yes, some of them were silly. There are scattered mentions in letters and journals of children dreaming about flying cats, talking peaches, and battles fought with soup ladles instead of swords. Parents, naturally, wrote these off as nonsense, but also smiled quietly about them, because they reminded everyone, just for a moment, that childhood and war didn't always have to live in the same house. One story passed down in a smaller rural clan tells of a boy who kept dreaming of a white deer that followed him across a frozen field, every night for weeks. Eventually, his mother told him to follow the deer next time and ask it a question. In his dream, he did. The deer told him to watch the south wall. The next morning, the family found that the south wall of their home had been weakened by termites. Was it a coincidence? A wild, lucky guess? Or just the power of childlike awareness disguised as fantasy? That's the sort of thing that keeps historians up at night. And while a young samurai in training might fall asleep imagining his future glory, his sword gleaming in moonlight, the present was usually much humbler. It was a soft futon, a loyal dog curled at his feet, a mother's hand brushing hair off his forehead as he slipped into dreams of imaginary duels and talking cranes. The sword could wait. For now, the only battle was between wakefulness and sleep usually won. So tonight, as your own eyes grow heavier, picture the small rustles and sighs of a samurai family tucked under shared blankets, the slow breath of someone dreaming of foxes, the twitch of a foot, the soft snort of a father finally surrendering to exhaustion, unaware that a tiny elbow is headed for his ribs. Even the most legendary warrior was once a child who drooled in his sleep and kicked like a horse. That's comforting, isn't it? The air inside the samurai household is still, almost too still. But if you listen closely, you'll catch it. The faint shuffle of feet across tatami mats, the delicate creak of a door sliding open just wide enough to let in a breath of moonlight. You're not the only one awake. Midnight is a threshold hour, and for samurai, that moment between deep night and morning's edge carried all kinds of meaning. Sleep might have begun hours ago, but superstition, it never slept. Let's start with the curious matter of baby teeth. When a child lost one, there was no tooth fairy to tuck it away with coins and whimsy. Instead, samurai families followed a ritual. If the tooth came from the upper jaw, it was thrown under the house. If it came from the lower jaw, it was tossed onto the roof. This wasn't some weird recycling plan, it was symbolic, meant to encourage the new tooth to grow straight and healthy in the direction it was called to. Yes, dental alignment was a spiritual affair. Not that kids cared about the symbolism, they just wanted to see how far they could throw the thing. Some even whispered little chants as they tossed it, tiny, half-sung prayers to the spirits of health, or maybe just to amuse the ghost under the floorboards. Because oh yes, ghosts were absolutely part of the nightscape. You might not see them, but they were always listening. Samurai homes often contained kamidana, small household shrines dedicated to local kami or ancestral spirits. Before bed, many would stop by the shrine and offer a quick bow or a prayer. But if someone woke up in the middle of the night from a bad dream, or with a feeling they just couldn't shake, they might shuffle quietly to the shrine, relight a bit of incense, and murmur a second prayer. Just in case. You didn't want to risk angering the ancestors by ignoring a gut feeling. And if a candle flickered at the wrong moment, well, you'd probably stay up for another hour, just making sure the spirits weren't upset about that thing you said last Tuesday. There were also specific objects you weren't supposed to mess with at night. Combs, for example. It was considered bad luck to comb your hair after dark. It was said to invite wandering spirits or misfortune. If someone absolutely had to comb their hair late, they might chant a protective phrase under their breath while doing it. One tale tells of a samurai's wife who ignored this warning and later found her comb mysteriously cracked down the center, even though no one had touched it. Whether it was the result of tension in the wood or a whisper from the other side, she never combed after dusk. Again, historians still argue whether these midnight taboos stemmed from religious doctrine or folk traditions that simply latched onto the samurai class over time. Either way, they stuck. You could be armored in logic all day, but once the lanterns dimmed and your house creaked in its sleep, even the toughest warriors found themselves lighting one more candle, just in case something unseen was watching. Speaking of candles, their placement mattered too. One belief warned against sleeping with a candle facing directly toward the door. That direction was said to invite unwanted visitors, human or otherwise. Candles were often angled slightly away from thresholds or placed behind thin dividers. Soft, subtle light was thought to keep the darkness from getting too bold. Then there were the dream-blocking herbs. A little pouch of mugwort or irises might be tucked under a pillow if nightmares had been frequent. One especially quirky tradition involved placing a bit of charcoal under the bed to absorb dream impurities, like a spiritual air filter. Was it effective? Who knows? But if your sleep improved, nobody was questioning it. Some warriors had even stranger habits. There are a few reports of men placing their sheathed swords beside them in a specific orientation. Blade facing north or east, never west. It was symbolic of readiness, yes, but also of harmony with directional energy. You wouldn't want your katana's soul pointing the wrong way, after all. That's just asking for metaphorical turbulence or actual insomnia. Occasionally, more theatrical midnight rituals would take place. If a family had been suffering repeated illness or misfortune, a priest might be called to perform a cleansing ritual in the middle of the night. Picture it. Everyone awake in hushed reverence as the priest slowly circles the house, chanting and waving a ceremonial staff, while nervous children peek from behind doorways, and even the family dog decides it's not the night for barking. And let's not forget dreams involving the dead. These were treated with particular caution. If someone dreamed of a deceased loved one asking them to come along, the family took it seriously. The dreamer might be advised to visit a shrine, avoid travel for a few days, or make offerings to calm the spirit. Sometimes, a monk would be consulted. Sometimes, grandma just made a massive pot of soup and everyone stayed home for the day. Ghost dreams were not to be shrugged off, even if they were just your brain sorting out emotions. One of the more fascinating fringe beliefs involved the mirror trick. It was said that if you stared into a polished bronze mirror at midnight and whispered a question, the face of a kami, or something else, might answer in your reflection. You had to be alone. The room had to be silent, and if your own reflection winked at you, you were to cover the mirror immediately and not speak of it, ever. Scholars still argue whether this tale was a form of mystical ritual or just a way to scare younger siblings senseless. Still, not all superstitions were heavy. There were lighter ones too. A favorite involved folding your sleeping robe in a certain way to ensure pleasant dreams, left side over right, always. Doing it the wrong way invited spirits meant for the dead. People took that detail seriously, even half asleep. One charming little practice involved whispering your wish to the moon before sleeping. It wasn't guaranteed to come true, of course. But if the moon was full and you were quiet enough, it was said that a kind spirit might carry your wish into the realm of dreams. It's unclear if this was an official ritual or just something lonely teenagers made up to justify midnight poetry writing, but it's a lovely thought either way. Even silence had superstitious rules. In some regions, it was said you shouldn't whistle indoors after dark, or you'd invite snakes, or worse, bandits who heard it as a secret signal. Whether anyone actually believed that or just didn't want to hear tuneless whistling all night remains a mystery, but the rule stuck. And so, the samurai night was not just about rest, it was about care, balance, quiet negotiations with the invisible world. It was about respect for the unknown, for the ancestors, for the inner world that opened only after the lamps were dimmed. Your body might sleep, but your home, your spirit, your sword, they were never fully off duty. So tonight, as you lay still and the wind nudges at the windows like an old friend, know that the samurai, too, lay in that hush, waiting to dream, wrapped in layers of cloth and unseen beliefs. Maybe their minds wandered to old battles. Maybe they dreamed of rice fields or a childhood festival, or just that weird cursed comb they really should have thrown away. Sleep came wrapped in shadow and ceremony. And as you drift off now, let that same ancient quiet fold itself around you. By now, your futon's warmed and your mind is softening around the edges, but here's something you may not have considered. Just who exactly got to share a samurai's bed? And no, it wasn't always a romantic partner or a spouse or even a person, exactly. In a samurai's house, the futon might be more crowded or emptier than you'd expect. It all depended on rank, custom, and whether or not your cat insisted on sleeping across your face. Let's start with the obvious. Samurai did get married, of course, and many had spouses who shared their sleeping space, but not always in the modern, snuggly, honey, scoot over kind of way. Marriages among the warrior class were often strategic arrangements, with love growing slowly over time, if at all. In many cases, a husband and wife maintained separate quarters, particularly in wealthier households. They might share a futon occasionally, but it wasn't assumed that they slept together every night. Practicality, not pillow talk, ruled the arrangement, and when they did share a bed, it was typically a formal affair. No oversized mattress to roll around on, no flannel pajamas with cartoon ducks. Instead, a modest bedding layout, layers of soft futon padding, and perhaps one shared quilt, set on the tatami. Space was limited, and so was motion. You curled inward, close to your edge, respectful and contained. Intimacy was often scheduled, polite, and behind closed sliding doors you didn't casually burst through unless you really needed rice. But spouses weren't the only potential bedfellows. Enter the concubine. Some samurai, particularly those of higher status, kept concubines in addition to a legal wife. These relationships weren't always cloaked in scandal or secrecy. In many families, the wife managed the household while the concubine lived nearby, sometimes even within the same compound, and fulfilled a different role: emotional, physical, or occasionally ceremonial. Sleeping arrangements could get delicate, with rotating nights or separate annexes ensuring no one felt completely discarded. Historians still argue whether concubinage was a privilege of power or a burden of etiquette, especially for women navigating household politics. Still, even outside romance, samurai didn't always sleep alone. In colder regions or during campaigns, lower-ranked warriors often bunked in groups, sharing body heat beneath communal quilts. Imagine 6 warriors laid out like sardines, each carefully turned to the side so no one got a mouthful of snoring. You couldn't exactly hog the covers without risking your helmet getting mysteriously filled with rice gruel the next morning. Sometimes, samurai would share beds with apprentices or pages, young boys in training who served the warrior in daily matters. This wasn't necessarily inappropriate or suggestive, though it has led to plenty of modern assumptions. In many cases, it was about mentorship and convenience. A senior warrior might keep a page nearby to fetch items, help with armor at dawn, or act as a guard dog with good hearing. Fringe records even mention dreams being interpreted jointly, an apprentice recalling what his master dreamed, as though sleep had a shared frequency. Whether that's symbolic or just weirdly codependent, you decide. And then there were animals. Yes, cats show up more often than you'd think in samurai-era diaries. Valued for pest control and loved for their aloof elegance, some cats were treated as household members, complete with collars, names, and the run of the place. It's not unheard of to find descriptions of samurai waking up with a feline stretched luxuriously across their chest. One tale speaks of a particularly noble tomcat named Kuro, who once slept on a visiting merchant mid-snore and was declared a guardian spirit thereafter. Sleep with a cat once, and suddenly it's his futon. Dogs, on the other hand, were more likely to be outdoors or stationed near the door for protection, though a few smaller breeds crept their way inside when the weather dipped below freezing, and no one felt like arguing with a shivering fluffball at midnight. Some samurai even built small sleeping boxes near their beds for favored pets. You might think it odd that a warrior who could slice through a tree trunk kept a yapping lapdog by his side. But hey, companionship takes many forms. In moments of grief, beds became sacred spaces. When a family member passed, their sleeping mat was often left untouched for a period of time, a quiet tribute to their absence. A spouse might sleep alone for weeks, sometimes with an incense burner nearby to purify the air or invite calm dreams of the departed. Some lit a candle and let it burn overnight for 7 days, believing it would guide the soul safely on its journey. And then there were the lonely ones. Not every samurai had someone beside them. Warriors without family, stationed far from home, or newly promoted without companions often slept in isolation. For these men, the silence was thick. The creak of a settling house could sound like a scream. They might leave a lamp lit longer than necessary, or keep their sword slightly unsheathed, a psychological trick to feel less alone, like the blade was listening. There were also unusual sleeping arrangements driven by belief. One samurai reportedly slept with a wooden effigy of a fox deity beside him every night, convinced it brought him luck in battle. Another was said to keep a dried fish under his pillow to ward off evil dreams, though you can imagine the effect that had on his dating prospects. Historians aren't quite sure how widespread these habits were, but the line between custom and eccentricity was often thin and highly individual. You might wonder, was it comfortable, all this sleeping with others, be they people or pets or inanimate fox gods? Honestly, not always. Futons were thinner than modern mattresses. Tatami mats, while elegant, offered limited cushioning. You had to arrange your limbs carefully. Snoring could echo through paper walls. If someone kicked you, there wasn't a lot of space to roll away. And if the baby in the next room started crying, well, so much for your warrior's rest. Still, these shared spaces shaped bonds. A page who tucked his master in learned trust. A concubine who warmed the bedding before nightfall showed care that extended beyond duty. A child sneaking into their father's futon during a thunderstorm might one day grow into a warrior who remembered the comfort of a strong arm and the smell of cedar. These were not grand gestures, they were quiet ones. They were sleep's soft choreography, a nightly rehearsal of who mattered enough to be near and who did not. And you, curled up now in the calm hum of nighttime, maybe you understand that a little more deeply. Who we sleep beside says something about who we are. Not always love, not always politics, but something about where we rest our head when the world goes dark, and who we want breathing beside us in that moment when we are most vulnerable. So whether it's a spouse, a cat, a blade, or simply the silence itself, know that samurai too made their choices. Some bold, some strange, some deeply, achingly human. You're floating now, halfway between centuries and the weight of your own bedding, and the last candle of this story is flickering low. Let's not blow it out just yet. Instead, lie quietly for a moment in the final hour before dawn, because that's where the samurai's sleep story starts to close. Not with a clang of armor or a rooster's cry, but with stillness, a faint rustle, and the sense that something ancient is gently letting go. The last hour of the night was sacred in ways most modern sleep schedules don't quite grasp. For the samurai, it wasn't just a lead-up to breakfast or the moment you grumble and stumble toward the latrine. It was a liminal space, thin like rice paper, when dreams clung to your skin like mist, and your soul hadn't fully decided whether to return to the world or stay wandering. If you woke up just before dawn, you didn't leap out of bed. You lay still, you listened. The house, whether castle, countryside home, or temporary quarters, held its breath. You matched its rhythm. Your futon by then was likely half-kicked, creased from unconscious wrestling. Maybe your arm had gone numb, or your cheek was pressed against the woven edge of a tatami mat. The quilt had slipped, or the person next to you had curled the covers away in a silent nighttime tug-of-war. But you weren't cold. The body remembered warmth. The mind, meanwhile, was starting its quiet shuffle, pulling itself up through layers of sleep, dragging remnants of a dream about flying fish or lost scrolls or the sound of drums you never actually heard. It was in this hour that many samurai claimed to receive visions, not from some mystic realm necessarily, but from their own intuitive minds, finally free of the day's armor. One daimyo once insisted his greatest strategy came to him between the third and fourth rooster calls, not quite asleep, not quite conscious. Another wrote that he saw the image of his future daughter while dreaming, years before she was born. Historians still argue whether these twilight revelations were divine or just the brain tidying up loose thoughts while the floorboards creaked quietly below. Outside, the night began to loosen its grip. The cicadas fell silent. The birds hadn't quite begun. If you were stationed near a river, you might hear the slow lap of water against stones, barely more than a whisper. Wind shifted slightly through sliding doors that hadn't been shut all the way. A faint scent of ash drifted from the corner where the brazier had burned out. Somewhere, a servant stirred, careful not to wake the house too soon. These were moments not recorded in battle scrolls or legend songs, but they were real. Samurai were often early risers. The idea of sleeping in wasn't just foreign, it bordered on disrespectful. Oversleeping suggested laziness, disinterest in duty, or worse, vulnerability. A proper warrior was awake before the sun, having already meditated, straightened his bedding, and greeted the morning with a silent nod. But even before that, in those precious last 20 minutes, he often lay still, aware of his breath, grounding himself in the moment. If his sword lay beside him, his hand might rest on the hilt, not out of fear but as habit. A reassurance that he was still who he had been yesterday. You imagine it now. The room dimly lit with indigo shadows, your robes loose around you, the wooden rafters above faintly visible through your sleep-blurred eyes. A slight chill touches your toes and you tuck them under again. A dream lingers, slipping through your fingers like ink in water. You forget the plot, but the feeling stays. Maybe there was a mountain. Maybe your father stood beside you, even though he'd been gone 10 winters. Maybe the hawk returned, the one you released as a child, only this time it sat quietly on your shoulder. Even in sleep, samurai were taught that discipline mattered. Folding the bedding wasn't optional. As dawn came closer, futons were lifted and shaken out, quilts folded edge to edge, and the sleeping area returned to its proper state. Some warriors performed this with near-religious precision, as though the night itself had been a ritual that now required closure. You didn't leave your bedding in disarray. The way you slept said something about the way you lived. Even dreams, it seemed, had to end in proper posture. But not all endings were tidy. Some samurai awoke from nightmares, battles they'd fought replayed with cruel vividness, or the faces of comrades they couldn't save appearing in flashes of blood-red moonlight. There's one account of a general waking up in a sweat, convinced he was back on the field, yelling commands into the dark only to find he'd been shouting into his bedding. The dreams of warriors weren't always noble or victorious. They were sometimes haunted, confused, or deeply, deeply human, and no amount of folding could press those wrinkles away completely. Still, they rose. They always rose. Whether from dream or nightmare, from a warm futon or a damp sleeping mat laid in a barracks, the samurai stood up before the sun. They shrugged off the night like a thin second skin. They poured water over their hands, dressed in quiet layers, and stepped into the day. Not with fanfare, but with the practiced grace of someone who knew tomorrow might be louder, might be harder, might be their last. And you here now, as you settle deeper into your own cocoon of soft breath and shadow, maybe you feel a kinship in that quiet, not in the sword or the ceremony, but in the way the body prepares itself to begin again. You don't have to rise before dawn. You don't have to fold anything just yet. But you understand, don't you, that sleep is more than escape. It's preparation. It's remembering. It's letting yourself be unarmored for a little while longer. So let the final dream come softly now. Let the ghosts of old Japan whisper their goodbyes and close the screen door behind them. Let your own breath guide you down into silence. Because tonight, you slept like a samurai. So now, friend, we're here at the very edge of the tale where everything quiets down to a hush and even the breeze holds its breath. The story has folded itself like a futon, neatly, respectfully, and all that remains is the comfort that lingers in your chest, a calmness earned gently, word by word. You've journeyed through tatami mat corridors, paused at shadowy hearths, traced the threads of midnight robes, and listened for the fox gods beneath the floorboards. And all along the way, you followed the flickering path that led us not through battlefields or noisy honor duels, but straight into the soft underbelly of sleep. The place where even the strongest warriors let their guard fall, where dreams became counsel and breath became prayer. Let yourself drift now. The room around you is still, like a lake just before morning. Each object softened by sleep's velvet filter. The world has turned its volume down. You are wrapped in quiet things, the whisper of linen, the memory of warm straw underfoot, the deep, steady pulse of your own heart. Nothing here asks anything of you. Not yet. No armor waits by the door. No shoes to tighten. No scrolls to read before the candle dies. Just this moment, just the space between wakefulness and dreaming, where imagination and memory blend into something soft and safe. If your thoughts are still wandering, let them, but don't chase them. Watch them pass like paper lanterns floating down a moonlit stream. No rush, no grasping, just drift. You don't have to be anywhere else. There's no blade to draw, no code to recite. Only this breath and the next and the next. You're part of an ancient rhythm now, the same kind that guided warriors to rest centuries ago. The same that nudges birds to sing at dawn and trees to lean toward moonlight. It's all right to sleep. It's all right to let go. The world will still be there when your eyes open, and maybe, just maybe, you'll carry a little of this quiet with you into the day. So close your eyes or don't. Breathe slow. You've earned this rest.